The ocean looked empty that morning. Beneath that quiet surface moved fleets carrying thousands of men, aircraft engines humming above steel decks, and a war already tilting toward arithmetic. By June 1944, the Pacific conflict had entered a phase where distance measured in thousands of miles and fuel measured in millions of gallons dictated strategy. The United States Navy advanced across the Central Pacific with a fleet built from industrial capacity unmatched anywhere on Earth. Aircraft carriers displacing over 27,000 tons each launched planes carrying bombs weighing 500 or 1,000 pounds. Escort vessels protected them in rings, stretching dozens of miles outward. Supply ships hauled aviation gasoline, measured in tens of thousands of barrels, to sustain daily flight operations. Japan assembled its remaining carrier strength to stop that advance. The Imperial Japanese Navy still possessed several fleet carriers and dozens of escort vessels. Their aircraft remained fast and deadly in skilled hands. But the pilot corps that had dominated early Pacific battles had bled heavily since 1942. Training programs struggled to replace those losses. New pilots sometimes entered combat with far fewer flight hours than the veterans they replaced. An aircraft might still reach speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour, but the experience guiding it through combat had eroded. At the strategic level, the Japanese plan hinged on drawing the American fleet into range of land-based aircraft and carrier strikes simultaneously. Coordinated waves of bombers and torpedo planes would attack from different directions. Each aircraft carried explosive payloads capable of tearing open flight decks or igniting aviation fuel stored below. Inside the cockpit of a Japanese dive bomber climbing above the Philippine Sea, the pilot felt the engine vibrate through the airframe while scanning the horizon for enemy ships. The bomb mounted beneath the fuselage weighed several hundred pounds. The fuel tank held only enough gasoline for a limited range. Every minute spent searching burned precious gallons. Meanwhile, the American fleet waited with radar. By 1944, radar installations aboard U.S. warships could detect incoming aircraft formations long before they reached visual range. Controllers directed fighter squadrons toward approaching targets. American fighters, armed with machine guns firing thousands of rounds per minute, intercepted enemy planes dozens of miles from the carriers they intended to strike. The collision between these systems produced one of the most lopsided aerial battles of the war. Japanese strike groups launched aircraft in waves numbering in the hundreds, but many pilots struggled with navigation over open ocean. Some aircraft arrived piecemeal rather than as coordinated formations. Others encountered American fighters, guided precisely by radar data transmitted from ships below. I remember reading combat summaries from American carrier groups involved in the battle, and the phrase that appears repeatedly is interception distance. Fighters met Japanese aircraft far from the fleet itself. This meant enemy bombers faced gunfire long before they could begin attack runs. In the sky above the Philippine Sea, American fighters collided with Japanese formations at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. Machine guns firing rounds weighing ounces, stitched across wings and fuselages. Aircraft erupted in flames or spiraled toward the ocean below. Some Japanese pilots attempted to press forward despite damage, but defensive gunfire from escorting ships intensified as they approached. Inside an American fighter, diving toward incoming aircraft, the pilot felt the aircraft shudder slightly as guns fired in short bursts. Empty shell casings rattled across the cockpit floor. Ahead, an enemy plane attempted to maneuver, its engine leaving a faint trail of smoke. The scale of loss soon became staggering. Japanese carrier Aviation suffered devastating attrition during the battle. Dozens upon dozens of aircraft were destroyed during interception attempts. Entire strike groups failed to reach their intended targets. Pilots who survived often lacked sufficient fuel to return to their carriers after long search flights. On the ocean below, another disaster unfolded. American submarines, stalking the Japanese fleet, torpedoed two major carriers. Each vessel displaced tens of thousands of tons and carried aviation fuel, ammunition, and aircraft. When torpedoes struck hulls several inches thick, fires ignited within hangar decks. Explosions followed as fuel and munitions ignited in confined spaces. One carrier after another burned and eventually sank beneath the waves. When I once compared pre-battle Japanese air group rosters with the numbers remaining afterward, the difference felt almost mathematical in its finality. Hundreds of aircraft and experienced pilots vanished in a matter of hours. training pipelines in Japan could not replace that loss quickly enough to restore effective carrier operations. American forces also lost aircraft, many during difficult nighttime recoveries, when pilots returning from long missions struggled to locate their carriers in darkness. Yet the overall balance remained overwhelmingly one-sided. The United States possessed replacement planes and pilots, arriving from factories and training bases across the Pacific. Japan did not. Picture a carrier deck after sunset following the battle. Sailors guide incoming aircraft using dim lights, while exhausted pilots attempt to land with nearly empty fuel tanks. Engines sputter as planes roll across the deck. Some pilots miss the arresting wires and plunge into the sea beyond the ship's stern. The outcome of the battle fractured Japan's remaining carrier aviation strength. Without trained pilots and operational aircraft, carriers became little more than floating runways without planes. The Imperial Navy still possessed ships, but the striking power that had once dominated the Pacific had bled away. Strategically, the defeat opened the path toward the Mariana Islands. American forces soon captured airfields capable of launching long-range bombers, carrying payloads measured in several tons each. From those bases, aircraft would eventually reach the Japanese home islands themselves. If you are listening now, while the room grows quiet and the day begins to fade, imagine the Philippine Sea after the fighting ends. The horizon stretches empty in every direction. Somewhere beneath those calm waves lie aircraft, ships, and the remnants of a fleet that once carried Japan's hopes across the Pacific. This is the entire history of why Japan lost the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Chapter 1. The Paper War. Japan's strategic architecture meets reality. The 8th of May, 1934. A government building in the Kasumigaseki district of Tokyo, where the floors of the Imperial Japanese Navy's administrative headquarters smell of cedar and machine oil, and the particular kind of institutional anxiety that comes from planning a war you haven't started yet. Somewhere in that building, a budget request is being typed. Not a battle plan, not an operational order, a budget request, the most honest document any military organization ever produces, because it tells you not what a force wants to believe about itself, but what it actually costs to exist. The document requests funding to train 30 carrier-qualified pilots per month to a combat-ready standard of no fewer than 600 flight hours per candidate before fleet assignment. The number 600 is underlined. A margin notation, translated from the original Japanese, reads, "This standard is non-negotiable." I want you to hold that number in your mind for the entirety of this series. 600 hours. Because everything that follows, every carrier that burns, every pilot who doesn't come home, every wave of aircraft destroyed before it reaches the American fleet, flows directly from the moment that number became negotiable. To understand why Japan lost the Battle of the Philippine Sea on the 19th of June, 1944, you have to understand that the men who planned Japan's naval war were not fools. They were, in several respects, among the most sophisticated strategic planners of their era, officers who had studied Clausewitz and Mahan, who had observed the lessons of the Russo-Japanese War and the naval engagements of the First World War, and who had constructed a coherent, mathematically grounded theory of how Japan could fight and defeat a nation with roughly 10 times its industrial capacity. The theory was called Kantai Kessen, the decisive fleet engagement, and it was, in its own terms, a logical answer to a genuinely difficult problem. Japan could not match the United States in a prolonged war of industrial attrition. Everyone in the naval general staff knew this. The answer, therefore, was not to fight a long war. The answer was to fight one perfect battle, at the right moment, in the right place, and win it decisively enough to force a negotiated peace before American production could make the outcome inevitable. The architecture of that single perfect battle had been refined over more than a decade of staff planning, wargaming, and doctrinal development. In its fully elaborated form, the decisive battle concept worked in stages. First, American forces advancing across the Pacific would be whittled down by submarine attacks and land-based airstrikes before they ever reached the engagement zone, a process the Japanese called Zengen Sakusen, or attritional reduction. Second, when the weakened American fleet arrived for the climactic engagement, it would face a Japanese carrier force that was, by design, numerically comparable after all the preceding attrition. Third, in the decisive battle itself, Japanese naval gunnery, aerial torpedo attack, and the superior Bushido fighting spirit of the individual Japanese sailor and aviator would carry the day. When I was first working through the staff planning documents from this period, the pre-war War College lectures, and the translated interrogation reports from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, I found it genuinely striking how internally consistent this logic was. The plan wasn't irrational. It was rational in the same way that a bridge is rational, when every engineering calculation is correct, and the ground beneath it has quietly become unstable. What the plan required, above all else, was that the Americans cooperate with its assumptions. The Zenjin-Sakusen attrition sequence depended on American forces advancing along predictable corridors, through the Marshalls, through the Carolines, approaching the Philippine Sea from the east, in a route that Japanese submarines and land-based aircraft could reliably intercept. The decisive battle concept depended on the Americans being willing to engage in a fleet action before they had achieved such overwhelming numerical superiority that the outcome was predetermined. And the 600-hour pilot training standard depended on the war remaining, for long enough, at a sufficient distance from Japan's inner defensive perimeter that the training pipeline could operate without interruption. All three assumptions began failing within months of the war's opening shots. The American decision to island hop, to bypass the heavily defended Marshalls and Carolines, and strike directly at the Marianas, severed the attrition sequence entirely. There was no gradual whittling. American forces arrived at the gates of Japan's inner defensive perimeter without having passed through most of the killing grounds the Japanese had prepared for them. The plan had been drawn on a map that the enemy refused to follow. The Naval General Staff, to its considerable credit, recognized this problem, at least at the technical level. By early 1944, a new operational plan, designated AGO, had been developed by Admiral Soemu Toyota and his staff to adapt the decisive battle concept to the changed strategic circumstances. AGO retained the core logic of Kantai Kessen: concentrate the carrier fleet, engage the Americans in a climactic battle, achieve a decisive result, but added a new element. Japan's carrier air groups would be supplemented by land-based aircraft operating from airfields in the Marianas and Carolines, effectively extending the mobile fleet's strike radius and compensating for the numerical inferiority in carrier aircraft. On paper, this was clever. The AGO plan anticipated roughly 500 total aircraft participating in the decisive engagement, approximately 430 carrier-based and roughly 100 land-based. 500 aircraft, combined with the superior range of Japanese carrier planes and the shuttle bombing tactic that would allow Ozawa's strikes to attack the American fleet and then divert to Guam to refuel rather than attempting the return trip to their carriers, gave the plan a certain geometric elegance. The geometry, as we'll see, depended entirely on the land-based air being there when needed. What neither Toyota nor anyone else in the Naval General Staff could fully acknowledge in their formal planning documents, and this is the quiet, terrible center of this entire story, was that the decisive battle had already been fought and lost, incrementally, in the skies over Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands between the summer of 1942 and the autumn of 1943. The carrier air groups that Japan needed for Kantai Kessen were not sitting in their hangars, rested and ready. They were dead, scattered across 2,000 kilometers of Pacific Ocean in the wreckage of the Solomons campaign, where Japan had fed its irreplaceable trained aviators into a land-based attrition battle, day after day, against improving American fighter tactics, at the end of a logistical supply chain that grew longer every month. The men who were supposed to fly the decisive battle in June 1944 were, in many cases, men with 150 training hours and no combat experience whatsoever, flying into the most sophisticated anti-aircraft defense network in the history of naval warfare. They didn't know that yet. Neither, fully, did their commanders. And that, the institutional inability to know, is where this story actually begins. To me, the most revealing detail in all the pre-battle planning documents isn't the tonnage calculations or the operational maps. It's a second document, from 1943, in which an unnamed section chief in a Naval General Staff appendix quietly estimates that the American fleet, if challenged near the Marianas, would bring more than 900 carrier aircraft to the engagement, significantly higher than the 700 figure used in the main planning document. The appendix was not formally circulated. The main document used the lower number, In every war planning archive I've ever worked through, that kind of discrepancy, the higher, less comfortable estimate buried in an appendix, while the optimistic figure drives the main plan, tells you more about an institution's state of mind than any operational order ever could. It tells you that the people writing the plan already knew, somewhere beneath the official optimism, that the numbers didn't work, and they proceeded anyway. Interestingly, the doctrine Japan had built its entire naval strategy around, the decisive single battle concept, was not originally a Japanese idea at all. It was adapted from the writings of the American naval theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan, whose 1907 treatise on sea power argued that decisive fleet engagements were the determinative events of maritime history. Japan had built a war strategy around the intellectual legacy of the nation it was fighting. The irony would be funny if the consequences weren't so grave. The Kantai Kessen doctrine borrowed Mahan's framework, translated it into a Japanese cultural and institutional context, and added the specific assumption, drawn from the Japanese reading of the Tsushima Battle of 1905, that spirit and sacrifice could compensate for material disadvantage. Mahan himself never argued that. He argued that material superiority, properly concentrated and applied, was decisive. Japan took his framework and removed the part about material superiority. What remained was a beautiful theory with a fatal gap at its center. By the spring of 1944, the operational mathematics of ego were, in the bluntest possible terms, broken. American carrier production had accelerated to a pace that Japanese shipbuilders could not approach. 7 Essex-class fleet carriers had been commissioned between December 1942 and June 1944 alone, each displacing more than 27,000 tons and capable of operating more than 90 aircraft. The United States was completing a fleet carrier, one carrier, fully equipped, with trained air groups, at a rate of roughly 1 every 75 days. Japan had no comparable program, no comparable industrial base, and no comparable petroleum supply to train the pilots who would have flown from those carriers, even if they had been built. The arithmetic of the coming battle was written long before the battle was joined. The question isn't why Japan lost the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The real question, the one this entire series is organized around, is why an intelligent, sophisticated naval leadership committed its last carrier force to a battle the ledgers had already decided, and what they believed, in that last moment before the aircraft launched, they were fighting for. In the weeks before the battle, when the first mobile fleet was assembling at its anchorages at Tawi-Tawi, in the Sulu archipelago, one of Ozawa's staff officers reportedly remarked to a colleague, the account is preserved in a post-war United States Strategic Bombing Survey interview, though the speaker is not named, that the fleet was prepared to fight, not prepared to win, prepared to fight. The distinction may have seemed small at the time. In retrospect, it was the most precise possible description of Japan's strategic position in June 1944. The fleet was ready to fight. The war, however, had already moved on. Chapter 2. The Bleeding Years. Coral Sea, Midway, and the drain that could not be refilled. The 7th of August, 1942, a morning so humid that the instruments aboard the carriers of the Japanese combined fleet registered 68% atmospheric moisture, which matters, not for atmosphere, but because it tells you something precise about the operating conditions for aircraft engines in the Solomons Theater that no poetry about tropical warfare ever quite captures. Somewhere near Rabaul, on the northeastern tip of New Britain, a Japanese carrier-trained aviator, one of roughly 800 men who had reached full combat qualification standard before the war began, was being briefed for a land-based strike mission over Guadalcanal. He had trained for carrier operations. He had practiced torpedo runs at wave-top altitude against maneuvering target ships, navigated over open ocean without landmarks, landed on a carrier deck at night. He was, by any objective measure, one of the finest military aviators on Earth in 1942. And on this morning, the Imperial Japanese Navy was sending him to fly a land-based strike mission from a jungle airstrip at the end of a 600-kilometer supply chain against an American fighter defense that was learning, week by week, precisely how to kill him. He would not survive the Solomons campaign. Neither would most of the men like him. The story of why Japan lost the Battle of the Philippine Sea almost always begins in June 1944, with the radar screens lighting up, the Hellcats climbing to altitude, the great aerial slaughter historians would later call the Marianas Turkey Shoot. But the real story begins here, in the Solomons, 18 months earlier, in the grinding arithmetic of an attrition campaign that consumed Japan's carrier air arm, one man at a time, in a theater and a tactical context for which that air arm had never been trained. It's worth being specific about what was lost, because the numbers are almost unbearably precise in their implications. Japan began the Pacific War with a carrier aviation force of roughly 500 frontline qualified aviators, men who had met the 600-hour standard, who had been through the full qualification sequence, who could navigate at night and land on a moving deck in 3-meter swells. At the Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942, roughly 90 of these men were killed, or so severely wounded that they could not return to frontline service. At Midway, in June of that same year, roughly 110 more died. Neither battle, taken alone, was fatal to the force. Together, they removed a fifth of Japan's pre-war carrier-qualified aviator corps in the space of 4 weeks. What followed in the Solomons was something different in character from Coral Sea or Midway. Not a sharp, concentrated loss, but a slow, 18-month hemorrhage that the training pipeline could never keep pace with. The campaign began when American forces landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, and it ended only in November 1943, when Japanese forces finally withdrew from Bougainville. In that period, the Imperial Japanese Navy committed carrier-trained aviators to daily land-based combat operations from Rabaul and its satellite airfields, flying missions that could run 500 kilometers each way, against American fighter opposition that was, month by month, becoming more tactically sophisticated. American pilots were learning specifically how to defeat the Zero, learning to avoid its turning radius, to exploit its vulnerability in a diving attack, to use its lack of armor and unprotected fuel tanks against it. Japanese pilots were learning nothing, because the ones who had accumulated enough combat experience to refine their tactics tended to be the ones who were dying. The historian John Lundstrom, in his meticulous reconstruction of the campaign, estimated total Japanese naval aircraft losses in the Solomons at more than 2,000, with approximately 1,500 aviators killed or permanently removed from operational service. When I first worked through Lundstrom's casualty tracking methodology, cross-referencing his figures against the United States Strategic Bombing Survey interrogation reports, what struck me wasn't the total figure, it was the quality distribution. The men dying in the Solomons were, disproportionately, the veterans. The men surviving were, disproportionately, the replacements. This matters enormously for understanding June 19, 1944, and it requires a brief excursion into the mechanics of Japanese pilot training that most histories of the battle skip over too quickly. Becoming a carrier-qualified aviator in the Imperial Japanese Navy before the war was a multi-year process, and each stage of it built on the previous one in ways that couldn't be abbreviated. Basic flight training, getting a man into the air and keeping him there safely, took roughly 6 months. Advanced aerobatics and formation flying took another 6. Navigation over open ocean, the specific skill of finding a carrier group after a 300-kilometer strike mission with no landmarks and potentially changing weather, took months of dedicated practice that couldn't be rushed without producing men who got lost and died. And finally, carrier landing qualification, the specific, brutal, unforgiving skill of bringing an aircraft onto a moving flight deck at 90 knots with an arresting hook, required a minimum of several months of consistent practice to reach reliability. You couldn't teach any of these skills in 3 months. The human nervous system doesn't compress on command. The 600-hour standard wasn't bureaucratic conservatism. It was the minimum flight time in which a human being could physically develop the neural pathways and muscle memory that carrier aviation demanded. By the end of 1943, Japan's emergency expansion of its pilot training program had increased the annual number of graduates, on paper, but had accomplished this by cutting training hours, combining qualification stages, and sending men to advanced training before they had fully consolidated the skills of the preceding phase. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey's interrogations of Japanese naval aviation officers after the war produced one figure that I keep returning to whenever I look at the Philippine Sea casualty data. By early 1944, the average carrier-assigned pilot in Ozawa's first mobile fleet had logged between 190 and 250 total flight hours before his combat assignment. The The pre-war veterans had 600 or more. Some of the Pearl Harbor strike pilots had over 1,500. The replacement pilots of June 1944 had roughly a third of the minimum standard that Japan's own planners had declared non-negotiable a decade earlier, and they were being sent to fly missions of 800 kilometers round trip over open ocean against an enemy who had radar. Warrant Officer Saburo Shindo, a veteran Zero pilot who survived Coral Sea and was later assigned to train replacement crews, describes the situation in his post-war deposition with a precision that no summary can improve upon. The students he was given in late 1942 had logged on average between 100 and 130 total flight hours before being assigned to his advanced instruction course. "These are not pilots," he wrote. "These are men who have flown." The distinction he was drawing was not about courage or commitment. Those qualities, the records consistently show, were present in abundance among Japan's wartime replacement pilots. The distinction was about capability. A man who has flown 130 hours has demonstrated that he can get an aircraft into the air and back on the ground without killing himself. He has not demonstrated that he can navigate at night over open water, execute a coordinated torpedo attack against a maneuvering warship at 60 meters altitude, manage his fuel state across a 400-kilometer mission profile, and then find his carrier in deteriorating weather and land without an arresting wire. Those are different skills. They take time that the Solomons campaign had consumed. I find it particularly telling, and this is a detail that tends to get lost in the tactical narratives of the Philippine Sea battle, that the training degradation wasn't even fully visible to the Japanese Naval General Staff at the level of formal planning. The training hours were being cut. The standards were being compressed. But the official administrative documents continued to describe graduates as carrier qualified, because the qualification process had been redefined to match what the training pipeline could actually produce rather than what the operational mission actually required. It's a form of institutional dishonesty that isn't unique to Japan and isn't unique to 1944. It's the kind of thing that happens whenever a bureaucracy faces an impossible demand and resolves the impossibility on paper rather than in practice. The pilots were certified, they just weren't ready. There's another dimension to the training crisis that rarely receives adequate attention, and it connects directly to the fuel crisis we'll examine in detail in Chapter 10. By early 1944, aviation fuel rationing in Japan's training command had reduced flight hours per student from the already compressed wartime standard of 250 hours to approximately 175 hours for the cohorts being assigned to Ozawa's fleet. The causal chain runs like this. American submarines are sinking Japanese tankers in the waters between Borneo and the home islands. Less refined petroleum reaches Japanese refineries. Less aviation spirit is produced. The training command receives reduced fuel allocations. Students fly fewer hours before being declared combat ready. The submarine commander, who launched a torpedo at a tanker off Borneo in January 1944, killed, with that single weapon, not a tanker crew, but a future carrier pilot's training hours. And through those training hours, on June 19th, a flesh-and-blood human being over the Philippine Sea. The supply chain of defeat runs through fuel ledgers and training logs, long before it runs through anti-aircraft bursts and burning aircraft. The Operation I-Go air offensive of April 1943 deserves a specific mention here, because it illustrates with particular clarity how Japan's institutional culture compounded each individual problem into a larger one. Yamamoto committed approximately 300 aircraft, including a significant proportion drawn from carrier air groups that were supposed to be reconstituting after the Solomons' losses, to a week-long mass air offensive over Guadalcanal and the New Guinea coast. The operation consumed roughly 104 aircraft and their crews in 1 week. The after-action reports, compiled from returning pilots' claims, declared the operation a substantial success, significant American losses, meaningful damage to Allied air power. The actual results, as American records would later establish, were far more modest. Yamamoto, believing his own after-action reports, transmitted a schedule of congratulatory visits to frontline units, a schedule that American signals intelligence, working from decrypted Japanese naval codes, used to arrange his death. He was killed on the 18th of April, 1943, 16 days after I-Go ended. The operation that consumed carrier pilots Japan couldn't replace also generated the radio traffic that killed the one admiral most likely to have recognized and acted on the true scale of the pilot quality crisis. By November 1943, when the Solomons campaign finally ground to its end, and the surviving elements of Japan's naval aviation returned to their carriers for reconstitution, the accounting was brutal. The first air fleet, the carrier air arm that had struck Pearl Harbor, sunk HMS Repulse and Prince of Wales, dominated the Indian Ocean in 1942, had been gutted. Reconstituting the carrier air groups would take months. Training the replacement pilots to anything approaching pre-war standard would take years that the strategic situation simply didn't allow. Japan had roughly 6 months before the Americans moved on the Marianas. 6 months to rebuild an air arm that had taken a decade to construct. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, in a very real sense, was already over. The remaining question was simply how long the losing would take. Chapter 3. The Stolen Blueprint. The Z Plan, a Typhoon, and the Filipino Guerrillas. The 31st of March, 1944, somewhere over the Philippine Sea, in weather that ground observers described as a fully developed typhoon system, with sustained winds of more than 120 kilometers per hour, 2 large Kawanishi flying boats are attempting to navigate from Palau to Davao in the southern Philippines. The aircraft carry Admiral Minichi Koga, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet, and his Chief of Staff, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome. American carrier forces have been raiding Palau for days, and the decision has been made to move the fleet command to a more secure location. The weather is terrible. The decision is made to fly anyway. One aircraft, carrying Koga, vanishes. He is never found. The second aircraft, carrying Fukudome, crashes off the coast of Cebu Island. Fukudome survives, floats to shore in his life vest, and is taken captive by Filipino guerrillas operating under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Cushing's resistance network. Fukudome is alive. His briefcase, sealed in a waterproof inner pouch by a careful member of his staff before the flight, is also recovered from the wreckage. Inside that pouch is a document that will help determine the outcome of the largest carrier battle in history, 2.5 months later. The document Fukudome was carrying has come to be known, in the historical literature, as the Z Plan, a comprehensive strategic blueprint for Japan's defensive battle in the Pacific, developed by Koga in the summer of 1943 and updated in early 1944. It outlined, in considerable operational detail, the sequence of defensive actions Japan would take against an American advance toward the Philippine Sea, the formation structure of the carrier fleet, the planned supplementary role of land-based air units, the tactical framework for the decisive engagement, and the specific geographic zones where Japan intended to force the climactic battle. This was not an intelligence summary or an order of battle document. This was the actual war plan, the architecture of the battle the Americans were about to fight. And Fukudome had been carrying it through a typhoon in a waterproof case that his own staff member had sealed before the flight. I've spent some time thinking about that staff member, unnamed in any record I've been able to find, who made the administrative decision to put the plan in a sealed case. They saved the document that would help defeat the operation it described. Cushing's guerrilla network found itself in possession of something extraordinary and immediately understood that it needed to move. Japanese forces launched a massive search operation for Fukudome and for important documents. The search orders were specific about that phrase, within hours of the crash. Cushing's people were under pressure. The solution they arrived at was a negotiation that reads, in the after-action records, as one of the more improvised intelligence operations of the Pacific War. They would return Fukudome to Japanese custody to prevent Japanese reprisals against Filipino civilians, but they would retain the documents long enough to have copies made. The Z Plan was photographed, copied by hand, and translated by Cushing's staff with whatever linguistic resources the guerrilla network could muster in the Philippine jungle. The copies were then transported, ultimately by the submarine USS Creval, to General MacArthur's Military Intelligence Service headquarters in Brisbane, Australia. From Brisbane, they went to Admiral Nimitz's Pacific Fleet headquarters in Honolulu. From Honolulu, the translated Z Plan was distributed to fleet commanders in the Philippine Sea. The entire chain, crash, capture, negotiation, copying, Submarine transport, translation, and distribution took roughly 3 weeks. By early June 1944, Admiral Raymond Spruance knew, in substantial detail, the structure of the attack that was coming. There is a genuine historiographical debate here that I want to address honestly, because it changes how you read everything that follows. Samuel Eliot Morison, in the 8th volume of his Naval History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, argues that the Z-Plan capture was decisive in shaping American preparations, that Spruance's specific decisions about fleet positioning and mission priority were directly informed by knowledge of the Japanese plan. H.P. Wilmot, in The Barrier and the Javelin, published in 1983, takes a notably cooler position, arguing that the Z-Plan was substantially obsolete by the time it reached American commanders, that Operation A-Go, the actual plan used in June 1944, differed in several operational respects from the Z-Plan framework, and that American radar and fighter direction capabilities would have produced a comparable result regardless of prior knowledge. Both positions are serious scholarly arguments from serious historians, and I don't think either one is simply wrong. What Greg Bradshaw's archival work at the United States National Archives established in his 2005 analysis of the Z-Plan documents in Record Group 38 is that the plan reached Spruance's fleet commanders in sufficiently complete form and sufficiently in advance of the battle that it demonstrably influenced his pre-battle positioning decisions. Whether it was decisive is perhaps unanswerable. That it mattered seems to me reasonably clear. The specific way it mattered is worth tracing. The Z-Plan described, among other things, a specific diversionary tactic. Japanese forces would use feints and deceptive movements to draw the American fleet westward, away from its amphibious landing protection mission near Saipan, before committing the main carrier strike. Spruance, according to his post-war account and his contemporaneous communications with Nimitz, was specifically alert to this possibility. When Mitscher requested permission on the night of the 18th of June to steam west overnight to reach a dawn strike position against Ozawa's fleet, Spruance refused, and his refusal was explicitly grounded in concern about a Japanese end run on the Saipan landing fleet. That concern was, in its specifics, drawn from the Z-Plan's documented tactics. Whether the concern was proportionate, whether the Japanese actually had the surface strength to execute such a feint against the Saipan transports, is a separate question. The point is that Spruance's most consequential decision of the entire battle was shaped, at least in part, by a document that a Filipino guerrilla had copied in a jungle in April. The translation and distribution process deserves a moment's attention because it wasn't clean, and acknowledging the messiness is important for an honest account. Cushing's team was working under pressure, in a guerrilla environment, with whatever translators were available. The translation produced in the Philippines wasn't a polished professional rendering of a classified Japanese military document. It was a field translation, done fast, under duress. MacArthur's intelligence staff reviewed and refined it. Nimitz's staff received a further processed version. By the time the plan's key elements reached fleet commanders, they had passed through multiple translation and interpretation stages. The possibility that specific operational details were misread, compressed, or subtly altered in that chain of transmission is real. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey's post-war interviews with Japanese naval officers don't suggest that the Americans fundamentally misunderstood the plan's architecture, but they do suggest that certain tactical details, particularly the precise supplementary role and vision for land-based air, may have been clearer in the original Japanese than in the distributed American version. To me, the most quietly extraordinary aspect of the entire Z-Plan story isn't the intelligence coup itself. It's what Fukudome does afterward. He is returned to Japanese custody, as negotiated. He is debriefed by Japanese naval intelligence. He reports the crash, his capture, and his rescue. And then, by his own account in post-war interviews, he is never formally asked whether the documents were compromised. No investigation is initiated. No formal inquiry is convened. The Japanese High Command appears to have made a collective, institutional decision not to examine the question of whether the plan had fallen into enemy hands. There are several possible explanations for this. The documents were in a sealed, waterproof case, which may have led to an assumption that they hadn't been recovered intact. The guerrillas had returned Fukudome, which may have suggested a straightforward rescue rather than an intelligence operation. Or, and this is the explanation I find most persuasive, given what we know about Japanese institutional culture in this period. There was a preference at the command level not to know. If the plan had been compromised, it would need to be fundamentally reconsidered. Reconsidering the plan, 3 months before the battle it described, in the face of every other pressure the combined fleet was managing, was not a comfortable option. What Fukudome did know, and what he reported to his superiors, was that the guerrillas had been in possession of documents. The specifics of which documents and what had been done with them were apparently not pursued. This isn't necessarily negligence. In wartime, intelligence security investigations take time and resources that are always in short supply, and the assumption that a waterproof sealed case hadn't been opened in the course of a chaotic crash rescue may have seemed reasonable. But the operational consequence of not asking the question was that Operation A-Go, which retained the structural framework of the Z-Plan, was executed against an enemy who had read its predecessor and had 2 months to think about it. When the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared on American radar screens at 150 miles on the morning of the 19th of June, Task Force 58 was not surprised. The fighter direction officers had their intercept vectors pre-planned. The combat air patrol was already at altitude. The battle had, in one specific and documentable sense, already begun in a Brisbane intelligence office in April. Lieutenant Colonel Cushing, the guerrilla commander who organized the document recovery, was not formally decorated for this operation in the immediate post-war period. The Z-Plan operation was classified for years, and the reconstruction of the full credit chain, from crash site to submarine to Brisbane to fleet commander, was accomplished largely by archival historians in the 1990s and 2000s, rather than by official military history. The Filipino fighters who transported the documents through Japanese-occupied territory, who risked and in some cases lost their lives to ensure those copies reached American intelligence, appear in the historical record as supporting characters in a story that the official histories were slow to tell fully. Bradshaw's 2005 analysis in the National Archives Journal Prologue is the most complete reconstruction available, and it's worth reading in full if you want to understand how messy and contingent the intelligence history of this battle actually was. The waterproof case that saved the Z-Plan documents was found, according to the National Archives custody record, with its seal intact when it arrived in Brisbane. Someone on Fukudome's staff had been careful. They had packed the documents properly for a long flight in bad weather. They had done everything right, and in doing everything right, they had ensured that the most sensitive operational document in the Imperial Japanese Navy arrived in perfect condition in the hands of the enemy. History has a sense of irony that no novelist would dare manufacture. Chapter 4. The Carrier That Never Should Have Sunk. Engineering the Taiho. The 7th of March, 1944. At the Kawasaki shipyard in Kobe, on a gray, late winter morning with the temperature hovering just above 4 degrees Celsius, the Imperial Japanese Navy commissioned its newest and most ambitious fleet carrier. She was the Taiho, Great Phoenix, and by every official measure, she represented the apex of Japanese carrier design. 29,300 tons standard displacement, an armored flight deck, 3.1 inches of Type D steel plate, capable of withstanding a 500-kilogram bomb impact from 1,500 meters altitude. Extensive torpedo protection blisters along her waterline. A reinforced hangar structure, the most comprehensive command facilities of any Japanese carrier yet built, from which Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would direct the decisive battle Japan had been planning for a decade. She was, by design, unsinkable, or as close to unsinkable as Japanese naval engineering had ever managed to produce. She would be in operational service for exactly 104 days. She would be destroyed not by superior American technology, not by overwhelming firepower, not by any failure of her armor or her structure, but by a single torpedo, a poorly located fuel tank, an inexperienced damage control officer, and the catalytic chemistry of unrefined Borneo crude petroleum in a closed hangar space on a tropical morning. The armored flight deck was completely irrelevant to her destruction. She was killed from the inside. The Taiho's design history begins in 1939, when the Naval Technical Bureau undertook a comprehensive study of how to build a fleet carrier that could absorb damage and survive. The lesson of the Battle of Midway in June 1942, where 4 Japanese fleet carriers were lost primarily to dive bombing, had not yet been written in June 1939, but the vulnerability of conventional carrier flight decks to aerial attack was already understood from observing British carrier operations in the Mediterranean. The Taiho's armored deck was the central design response. If bombs couldn't penetrate the flight deck, the carrier's aviation operations could continue even after being struck. This was sound engineering reasoning, and the armored deck design was genuinely effective. It would, under almost any conceivable bombing attack, have protected the ship's aircraft and ordnance from detonation. The problem was that the design also required trade-offs. Armored decks are heavy. To keep total displacement within manageable limits while maintaining the required aviation fuel capacity, the design team made a decision that would prove fatal. The forward aviation gasoline storage tanks were positioned directly below the forward aircraft elevator well. The elevator shaft was, in engineering terms, a large vertical tube running from the hangar deck through the flight deck, and beneath it, directly accessible to any structural rupture of the elevator pit, sat the principal forward fuel reserve. The plug in the flight deck sat directly above the most flammable space in the ship. This design compromise was not, in the context of 1939 carrier engineering, wildly unreasonable. The assumption built into it was that any torpedo or bomb damage to the hull below the waterline would be addressed by the Taiho's extensive damage control systems before fuel vapors could accumulate to dangerous concentrations. That assumption had two silent dependencies, neither of which held in June 1944. The first was that the Taiho's crew would be using standard, refined aviation spirit as their fuel, a product with a flash point high enough that modest leaks in a normally ventilated hangar space wouldn't produce explosive vapor concentrations at typical operating temperatures. The second was that the damage control personnel would be trained to the level required to manage the specific scenario of a ruptured aviation fuel tank feeding vapor into a closed space. By June 1944, neither dependency held. Japan's petroleum logistics had collapsed sufficiently that the first mobile fleet was operating on unrefined Tarakan crude petroleum from Borneo, which contains naphtha fractions that normal refining would have removed, and which volatilizes at temperatures roughly 15 degrees Celsius lower than standard aviation spirit. And the damage control personnel aboard the Taiho were, like most of the replacement crew complement in Ozawa's fleet, working from manuals written for a different fuel in a different strategic situation. At 0816 on the 19th of June, 1944, the American submarine USS Albacore, hull number SS-2-18, had maneuvered into an attack position against the Taiho after her fire control computer failed mid-solution. Lieutenant Commander James Blanchard made the decision to proceed with a manual firing solution and ordered all 6 forward torpedoes fired in a spread to maximize the probability of at least one hit. Of the 6 weapons, 4 ran off target. Japanese pilot Sakio Komatsu, who had just launched from the Taiho's deck as part of the second wave strike briefed for that morning, spotted one of the remaining 2 torpedoes tracking toward his carrier from the air. He dove his aircraft into the weapon's path. He died. His sacrifice deflected 1 torpedo. The 6th weapon struck the Taiho on her starboard side at the forward elevator compartment, tearing through the outer hull plating and rupturing 2 aviation fuel storage cells, containing a combined total of approximately 8,400 gallons of unrefined Tarakan crude. The initial flooding was rapidly controlled. The Taiho's propulsion and navigation systems were undamaged. She resumed flight operations within minutes of the impact. The damage appeared to be survivable. What followed over the next 7 hours was not a battle. It was a chemistry problem. The ruptured fuel cells were feeding their Tarakan petroleum. With its elevated naphtha content, its low flash point, its tendency to produce explosive concentration vapors at hangar deck temperatures, into the bilge spaces, the elevator well, and gradually the enclosed air volume of the hangar deck itself. This process is measured in hours, not minutes, and it proceeds quietly, invisibly, and with a kind of slow, mathematical inevitability that damage control manuals from the pre-Tarakan era weren't written to address. At some point, the exact timing is contested in the Japanese post-war accounts. A damage control officer made the decision to activate the hangar ventilation fans in an attempt to clear the accumulating fumes. The Japanese post-war analysis from the Shippai Engineering Failure Study Program, compiled decades later, suggests that this decision was catastrophically wrong. The ventilation fans didn't clear the fumes so much as distribute them, carrying explosive vapor concentrations through the ventilation ducts into compartments below the hangar deck, into the engine room approaches, into spaces that the initial fuel leak hadn't yet reached. The ship was being filled, systematically, by its own safety systems. When I was working through the technical failure analysis published by the Japan Science and Technology Agency's SHIPHI project, a post-war database of engineering failures that includes a detailed case study of the Taiho, what struck me most was a fairly simple engineering observation, buried about 2/3 of the way through the report. The Taiho's ventilation system had been designed and tested with the assumption of standard refined petroleum products. The flashpoint specifications used in the ventilation design calculations were based on normal aviation spirit. Nobody had modeled the ventilation system's behavior in an environment containing terracan crude vapor, because in 1939 and 1940, when the Taiho was being designed and her ship systems were being specified, nobody anticipated that Japan's petroleum logistics would be sufficiently compromised by 1944 that the fleet would be operating on unrefined Borneo crude. The design wasn't wrong, exactly. It was wrong for the war Japan was actually fighting in June 1944, which was a different war from the one the Taiho had been designed for. The Taiho detonated at approximately 1532. The accumulated fuel vapors ignited in what the surviving engineering analysis describes as a near-simultaneous explosion across multiple compartments. Not a single bang, but a rapid cascade of detonations, as the vapor cloud, distributed throughout the ship's interior volume by the ventilation fans, found ignition sources in the engineering spaces. The effect was functionally similar to a fuel-air explosive weapon detonated inside the hull. Ships are not designed to survive that from within. Ozawa and his flag staff were transferred to the heavy cruiser Haguro minutes before the final explosion. He lost his communications equipment, his code books, and his battle logs in the transfer. For the next several hours, the commander of Japan's first mobile fleet would have no reliable way to communicate with his strike aircraft or his supporting surface units at the precise moment when the battle he had launched that morning was being decided against him in the sky above. I want to be direct about what the Taiho's loss actually represents, because it's easy to describe it as bad luck. One torpedo, one decision, one catastrophic outcome, and miss the structural argument underneath. The Taiho was destroyed by the compounding of 3 separate failures, none of which was individually sufficient, and all of which were necessary. The design failure, fuel tanks beneath the elevator well, was made in 1939. The logistics failure, Tarakan crude in the fuel system, was made across the preceding 2 years as Japan's tanker fleet was progressively destroyed by American submarines. The training failure, damage control personnel not equipped to manage the specific scenario that unfolded, was made across the same 2 years as Japan compressed its naval training to match what the strategic situation allowed, rather than what the operational mission demanded. No single decision, made by any single person, at any single moment, produced the Taiho's loss. It was, instead, the product of a system that had been failing for years before the torpedo hit. The Taiho's armored flight deck, her defining characteristic, the feature that made her Japan's supposedly unsinkable carrier, the engineering achievement that the Naval Technical Bureau had most carefully invested its resources and reputation in, was entirely unrelated to her loss. The bombs that the armor plate was designed to stop never reached her. The torpedo that killed her struck below the waterline, ruptured a fuel tank that the armor had no bearing on, and initiated a chain of failures that the armor was irrelevant to stopping. Japan's most technically sophisticated carrier, built to survive the one threat her designers had prepared for, was destroyed by the 3 threats they hadn't. She was in service for 104 days. In that time, she fired none of her defensive guns in anger, absorbed no bomb hits that tested her armored deck, and demonstrated the limits of designing a ship for the last war's threats, rather than the current war's realities. The cost of building her had been approximately 103 million yen at 1943 budget figures. The Mark 14 torpedo that started the chain reaction cost the United States Navy roughly $10,000 to manufacture. Chapter 5, The Radar Revolution. Seeing the enemy first. The 19th of June, 1944, 09:57 in the morning. Aboard the carrier USS Lexington, operating as the flagship of Task Force 58, approximately 130 kilometers northwest of Saipan, A fighter direction officer is sitting at a plotting table in a compartment behind the bridge, watching a radar return that has just appeared on his scope at roughly 150 miles bearing 262 degrees, to the west-southwest, incoming. His compartment is not large. The air smells of electronics and cigarettes, and the particular metallic anxiety of men who have been at battle stations for several hours. The radar scope shows a mass of contacts, not a single aircraft or a small patrol, but a formation of perhaps 60 to 70 aircraft, organized in the way that strike packages organize themselves, flying in the direction of the fleet at approximately 220 knots. He has seen this on the training plots. He has rehearsed this scenario. He picks up his headset and begins broadcasting intercept vectors to the combat air patrol that has been orbiting at altitude, waiting for precisely this moment. He has approximately 39 minutes before the Japanese formation reaches the fleet. That is, in 1944, fleet air defense terms, a long time. Long enough. The system that the fighter direction officer was operating on the morning of June 19th was not improvised. It had been developed, refined, and practiced across 2 years of Pacific combat, drawn from the specific lessons of the Guadalcanal air battles, where American pilots had learned what it cost to intercept an incoming strike with inadequate warning, and where the value of organized, radar-directed air defense had proven itself in conditions that were frequently chaotic and sometimes catastrophic. By mid-1944, Task Force 58's integrated air defense system was the most sophisticated in the world. It began with the SK radar arrays aboard the Essex-class carriers, operating on a wavelength of approximately 1.5 meters, with a peak power output of roughly 200 kilowatts and a pulse repetition frequency of 60 to 120 pulses per second, giving reliable detection of large aircraft formations at 100 to 160 miles in favorable atmospheric conditions over open ocean. The system then processed those radar returns through a fighter direction network that assigned incoming contacts to sector teams, vectored combat air patrol fighters by VHF radio to intercept positions, and managed the altitude layering of multiple fighter groups simultaneously so that the entire sky between the Japanese formation and the American fleet was organized into a coordinated killing field. Japan had radar. Japan did not have this. The difference between having radar and having a radar-integrated fleet air defense network deserves a specific technical explanation, because it's the central mechanism of what happened on June 19th. Japanese carriers in 1944 carried radar equipment. They could detect incoming aircraft. But detecting an incoming formation and coordinating a fleet-wide intercepting response are operationally different problems, and solving the second requires not just hardware, but a specific organizational structure, a trained 4-man fighter direction officer team for each carrier, a standardized vocabulary of intercept commands, a sector assignment system, and a plotting methodology that can track dozens of friendly and hostile aircraft simultaneously without losing coordination. The Americans had developed this system. The Japanese had not. Individual Japanese carriers could see what was coming. They couldn't organize a fleet-wide response to what they saw. The contacts appeared on their scopes, and then the decisions about how to respond had to be made by individual ship commanders without a shared operational picture. By the time Ozawa's staff on the Taiho was processing radar data from his individual ships and attempting to coordinate a fleet-level response, Mitcher's fighter direction officers had already vectored their intercept groups and were watching the first contact reports confirm kills. The 4 waves Japan launched on June 19th became, in effect, 4 separate exercises in the catastrophic potential of that gap. The first wave, 68 aircraft, detected at 150 miles, intercepted at 70 miles, met roughly 25 Hellcats already positioned at altitude, still 30 minutes flying time from the nearest American carrier. By the time the first Japanese aircraft reached the battleship screen that formed the inner ring of fleet defense, approximately 41 of the 68 had been destroyed. The second wave, 107 aircraft, detected 120 miles, was intercepted at 60 miles and lost 97 of 107. The third wave, of 47 aircraft, lost fewer in proportional terms partly because it approached from a different bearing that created a brief gap in combat air patrol coverage, and partly because the fighter direction officer team was managing the aftermath of two simultaneous large engagements while the third was developing. The fourth wave, 82 aircraft, was given an incorrect fleet position by Ozawa's staff. The carriers had been maneuvering, and the navigation fix transmitted to the strike package was outdated. Flew past the American fleet without finding it, and attempted to land at Orote Field on Guam to refuel. American Hellcats were waiting above the airfield. 30 of the 49 aircraft that reached Orote were shot down during their landing approach. The rest were damaged beyond repair. The fourth wave was destroyed without ever engaging its intended target. Lieutenant Alexander Vrachu, flying with Fighter Squadron 16 from USS Lexington, accounts for 6 Japanese Judy dive bombers in approximately 8 minutes on the morning of June 19th. His after-action report, filed the following day, describes the engagements with a clinical brevity that says more about the tactical reality than any summary could. The first target, spotted from above at altitude, unaware of his presence, committed to its attack profile, required half a second of firing from his .650 caliber Browning machine guns. The second was already burning from the debris of the first. He found the third, fourth, and fifth in the same formation, each one flying the straight, predictable path that an attack run requires, each one lacking the armor protection or self-sealing fuel tanks that might have given it a chance of absorbing even a brief burst from his guns. By the time he returned to Lexington, the pilot debriefing officer reportedly had to ask him to slow down because he was describing events faster than they could be written. He was 23 years old. When I look at Vrachu's kill confirmations alongside the radar log entries from that same hour, what becomes clear is that his 6 kills weren't individual acts of exceptional marksmanship, so much as the logical terminus of a system: the radar pickup, the FDO vector, the altitude advantage, the gun ballistics of a 2,000 horsepower fighter, firing 6 weapons simultaneously against an aircraft with no armor. The system produced the outcome. Vrachu executed it. The variable time proximity fuse, classified so tightly that American commanders were initially forbidden from firing it in areas where duds might be recovered and analyzed by the enemy, deserves specific treatment here, because it changed the mathematics of anti-aircraft fire in ways the Japanese had no way to anticipate and no countermeasure for. A conventional anti-aircraft shell detonates either on contact with an aircraft or at a preset altitude determined before firing. It requires either a direct hit or a very accurate fuse setting to be lethal. A proximity fuse shell carries a miniaturized radio transmitter that detects the electromagnetic reflection from a nearby metal object and detonates the shell when it passes within approximately 6 meters of a target. It doesn't need to hit. It needs to pass nearby. Against an aircraft flying a predictable attack profile, a torpedo run at 60 meters altitude, a dive bomb approach at a prescribed angle, the proximity fuse converted near misses into kills with a reliability that transformed the mathematical relationship between attacking aircraft and defending gun batteries. The battleship and cruiser screen that formed the outer ring of Task Force 58's defense put up what the official reports describe as devastating barrages of VT-fused anti-aircraft fire. Against conventional Japanese attack profiles, in aircraft with no armor, on the morning of June 19th, those barrages were, in the most literal sense, lethal. When I was cross-referencing the American after-action gunnery reports from June 19th with the radar detection logs and the known timing of the Japanese wave attacks, I found it striking that the first wave, detected at 150 miles and intercepted at 70 miles, left so few aircraft to actually test the anti-aircraft defenses. Of the 68 aircraft in Wave 1, approximately 41 were destroyed by the Combat Air Patrol before reaching the battleship screen at all. The proximity fuse shells, the radar directors, the VT-fused 5-inch guns, they were the second line of a defense whose first line had already done most of the work. This matters for how you assess the relative contributions of the two defensive systems. The fighter direction network and the Hellcat pilots were the primary killing mechanism on June 19th. The anti-aircraft screen was the cleanup layer. Together they created a defensive depth that no amount of Japanese aircraft, at any level of pilot quality, could reliably penetrate. The total American anti-aircraft ammunition expenditure on June 19th represents a specific kind of industrial argument. Task Force 58's battleship and cruiser screen fired approximately 118,000 rounds of 40mm ammunition, roughly 82 tons of steel projected skyward in a single day of defense. The 5-inch gun batteries fired more than 14,000 rounds of proximity-fused ammunition. To sustain that rate of fire for a full day of battle and have sufficient ammunition remaining to continue operations the following day required a resupply chain, a manufacturing base, and an industrial logistics network that Japan simply couldn't match. Japan's total anti-aircraft ammunition consumption for the month of June 1944, across the entire combined fleet's operations, was less than Task Force 58's expenditure on June 19th alone. The battle wasn't just fought in the air, it was fought simultaneously in the munitions factories in Cleveland and the steel mills in Pittsburgh, months and years before the first Japanese aircraft appeared on the radar scope at 0957. The word that a pilot from USS Lexington used to describe the day's fighting during his debriefing, the word that gave the battle its enduring nickname, was Turkey Shoot. The phrase has passed into the historical vocabulary as a description of something easy, almost casual. Looking at the radar logs and the fighter direction communications records, I'd describe it differently. It was not easy. It was methodical. It was the outcome of 2 years of developing, testing, practicing, and refining an integrated air defense system until every component worked together as designed, against an opponent who had the courage to fly into it, but not the technology, the training, or the intelligence to defeat it. A turkey shoot implies that the turkeys had no chance from the beginning. What the records actually show is that Japan's aviators had precisely one chance. If the radar had failed, if the fighter direction had lost coordination, if the proximity fuse had not been deployed, or if the combat air patrol had been caught at low altitude, and that the Americans had prepared systematically to ensure that none of those things happened. The battle wasn't decided on June 19th. It was decided in every training exercise and radar calibration session and ammunition production run in the 2 years before. Chapter 6. Hellcat and Zero. The Machine Hierarchy. The summer of 1942, Akutan Island, in the eastern Aleutian chain, where the ground is tundra and the weather is almost always wrong, and where an Imperial Japanese Navy Mitsubishi A6M0 Sen fighter, serial number 4593, had made a forced landing and flipped onto its back in the soft ground, killing its pilot and leaving the airframe substantially intact. American forces found it. They understood immediately what they had. Here was the aircraft that had terrorized Allied pilots from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon. The plane that had shot down American, British, Dutch, and Australian aircraft in numbers that defied comfortable explanation. The machine behind which Japan had built a mythology of aerial invincibility. American naval intelligence had been trying to capture an intact Zero for months. Now one had effectively delivered itself. It was shipped to San Diego. A team of test pilots, engineers, and performance analysts flew it systematically, prodded its limits, mapped its performance envelope with the methodical attention that good engineering brings to understanding a problem. What they found was not a mystery. It was a set of numbers, and those numbers, precise, documented, reproducible, became the foundation of every tactical instruction issued to Hellcat pilots before the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Zero was, in its 1940 to 1942 operational context, genuinely extraordinary. Designed by Jiro Horikoshi and his team at Mitsubishi, the A6M achieved performance figures that no contemporary Allied carrier fighter could match, by making a specific and conscious set of engineering trade-offs. Eliminate weight, everywhere, at all costs, and concentrate the saved mass into speed, range, and maneuverability. The A6M has no pilot armor behind the seat. None. It has no self-sealing fuel tanks, the rubber bladders that American aircraft use to seal bullet holes and prevent catastrophic fuel loss in combat. Its airframe skin is thinner gauge aluminum than comparable Western fighters. Its wing loading, the ratio of aircraft weight to wing area, is approximately 22 pounds per square foot, compared to the F-6F Hellcat's 37.9 pounds per square foot. That lower wing loading is precisely why the Zero turns so beautifully at low speeds. Less mass per unit of lift means tighter radii, faster response, better climb. Every quality that made the Zero the most feared fighter in the Pacific in 1941 was a direct consequence of the decision to remove the protective features that might have saved its pilots' lives. The aircraft was optimized. Its pilot was the armor. He was asked to be perfect. The F-6F Hellcat was designed at Grumman's Bethpage facility on Long Island in direct response to Pacific combat experience. Initially based on intelligence assessments of the A-6M's performance, then refined after the Akutan Zero test data became available in late 1942. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine at the Hellcat's heart produces 2,000 horsepower at war emergency rating, roughly 60% more power than the Zero's 1,400 horsepower Sakai engine. At 23,400 feet altitude, the Hellcat achieves a maximum level speed of approximately 376 miles per hour, roughly 40 miles per hour faster than the A6M5 at comparable altitude. In a sustained dive, the Hellcat can reach 400 miles per hour, a speed at which the Zero's fabric-covered ailerons, unpressurized by hydraulic assistance, begin to balloon and deform, losing their effectiveness and making roll and pull-out inputs increasingly unresponsive. The Hellcat is heavier, less maneuverable in a turning fight at low speed, and decidedly less elegant than the Zero on paper. It is also, in every other respect, the better weapon for 1944 Pacific combat. The test pilots at San Diego were not simply looking for the Zero's weaknesses. They were looking for the Zero's specific weaknesses against a specific alternative platform, and they found them. The tactical memorandum that resulted from the Akutan evaluation and the subsequent combat experience analysis is not a famous document. It doesn't appear in many general histories of the Pacific War. But in the spring of 1944, it went to every carrier air group in the Pacific Fleet as standard pre-deployment reading, and it contained, in 7 numbered points, the exact instructions for how a Hellcat pilot should fight a Zero and survive. Do not turn with the Zero at speeds below 300 knots. You will lose. Do not attempt to follow a Zero in a climbing turn. You will lose. Do engage from above, in a diving attack, where your speed advantage is decisive and the Zero's maneuverability advantage is irrelevant. Do extend after the pass, climb away at military power, and re-engage from above. Do use your altitude advantage and your fuel state management to control the pace of the engagement. The document is remarkably clear about the fundamental asymmetry. The Zero will always be more maneuverable at slow speed. The Hellcat will always be faster in a dive, harder to kill, and better armed. Don't fight the Zero's battle. Fight yours. The armament comparison matters and is rarely detailed with sufficient precision. The A6M50 carries two 20mm Type 99 cannons, slow firing, with a relatively modest ammunition supply of roughly 100 rounds per gun, and two 7.7mm Type 97 machine guns, which are approximately equivalent in caliber to a rifle cartridge. Against an armored cockpit and self-sealing tanks, the 20mm cannons can cause serious damage, but they require sustained, accurate fire. Several hits on non-critical areas may not be enough. Against the Hellcat's construction, a Zero pilot needed to hold his aim for meaningful fractions of a second. The F-6F-3, in contrast, carries 650 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, each firing at approximately 800 rounds per minute, synchronized to converge at a specific range. Against the Zero's unarmored cockpit and unprotected fuel cells, approximately half a second of accurate fire from a converging gun Hellcat produces results that are not ambiguous. The Hellcat didn't need a kill shot. It needed to be pointed in the right direction for a moment. When I was reviewing the gun camera footage analysis from the Philippine Sea battle, the frame-by-frame assessment compiled by the Naval Aviation gunnery evaluation teams, what struck me wasn't the accuracy statistics or the kill confirmation rates. It was the engagement duration data. Most of the kills recorded on June 19th were short engagements, 2 to 4 seconds of firing time, 1 pass, 1 result. The fighters weren't dueling. They were executing intercepts from altitude against targets that couldn't see them coming, in aircraft that couldn't absorb even brief hits, flown by pilots who hadn't been trained to manage the specific scenario of a high-speed diving Hellcat attack from above. The Akutan test program had identified precisely this asymmetry. The tactical memorandum had taught Hellcat pilots to exploit it. On June 19th, they did. The Japanese answer to the Zero's mounting vulnerability was the A6M5 variant, introduced in late 1943, which strengthened the wing skin to allow slightly higher dive speeds, added a modest exhaust ejector system for marginal speed improvement, and thickened the fuselage skin in a few areas. It was approximately 32 miles per hour faster in level flight than its predecessor. It was still outmatched by the Hellcat in every performance category that mattered for the tactical situation of June 1944. The improvements were genuine engineering work. They were also insufficient by a margin large enough to be fatal. Japan was improving the Zero against the standard of the aircraft it had been losing to in 1942. The Americans had spent the same period designing a new aircraft against the standard of the aircraft they would need to defeat in 1944. The institutional timescales were different, and the timescale difference was itself a form of industrial advantage. The kill ratio claimed by American naval aviation for the Hellcat against the Zero in the Philippine Sea battle is, as a historical figure, contested. Official American after-action reports from June 1944 assert a ratio of approximately 13 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every American aircraft lost in air-to-air combat, a figure that post-war Japanese records analysis suggests may be inflated by roughly 20 to 30% through the standard wartime overcounting that affects every Air Force's combat claims. Even at the adjusted figure of 9 to 10 Japanese aircraft per American, the ratio represents a structural dominance of a kind that no individual Japanese pilot skill could compensate for. The calculation is simple. Even if every Japanese pilot in the sky on June 19th had been a veteran ace with 1,000 combat hours, the tactical situation, inferior aircraft, inferior radar warning, inferior communications coordination, arriving at altitude against pre-positioned fighters who had been waiting for them, could not have produced a favorable result. The machine hierarchy was not the only reason Japan lost June 19th, but it was the reason that made every other reason permanent. To me, the most telling detail in the entire Hellcat Zero comparison isn't a performance specification or a kill ratio. It's a single engineering choice made at Grumman in 1942. When the design team was finalizing the Hellcat specifications, they had the option to reduce the aircraft's weight by removing the armored pilot seat back, the steel plate behind the pilot's head and torso that added approximately 50 pounds to the airframe. Removing it would have improved the Hellcat's performance metrics marginally. They kept it. They kept it because the design philosophy of the F6F was fundamentally different from the A6Ms. The pilot was not the armor system. The armor was. The pilot was the most valuable asset to be protected. The aircraft was the tool. That single design philosophy, the pilot's life as a design constraint rather than a design sacrifice, produced, over 3 years of Pacific combat, a survivability rate for Hellcat pilots that the Zero could not approach. The men who flew Hellcats on June 19th came home at a rate that made their skills, their experience, and their institutional knowledge available for the next battle. The men who flew Zeros, by and large, did not. Chapter 7. Ozawa's Gamble. The Architecture of a Doomed Attack. The 16th of June, 1944. Somewhere in the western Philippine Sea, roughly 600 kilometers southwest of Saipan, the largest Japanese carrier fleet assembled since Pearl Harbor is completing its refueling. 9 carriers, 5 battleships, 7 heavy cruisers, 31 destroyers, 6 fleet oilers. The ships are moving in a formation so large that observers on the destroyer screen couldn't see the opposite edge of it. On the flag bridge of the Taiho, brand new, armored, the most powerful carrier Japan had ever commissioned, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa is looking at his charts. He knows the Americans have landed on Saipan. He knows the decisive battle he has spent his career preparing for has finally arrived. What he doesn't know, can't know, because the communications from his land-based air commander have been unreliable for days, is that the airfields he is counting on to supplement his carrier force are already cratered and largely empty. The aircraft he believes will meet his incoming strike waves over Guam and provide refueling, rearming, and a second attack run are, for the most part, already burning on the runways. Ozawa's plan is architecturally elegant. Its foundations are gone. Ozawa was not a reckless commander, and it would be a disservice to the historical record to portray his operational plan for June 19th as the product of arrogance or incompetence. He was, by most assessments, including those of American officers who studied his decisions after the war, among the most technically sophisticated carrier admirals Japan produced. His tactical concept for AGO was genuinely creative in one specific respect: the shuttle bombing approach. Because his carriers were operating at a range of roughly 380 to 420 kilometers from the American fleet, beyond the combat radius of American aircraft operating from Task Force 58, Ozawa intended to exploit this distance advantage. His aircraft would fly out to attack the American fleet, then instead of attempting the long return flight to their carriers, they would divert to the Guam and Rota airfields to refuel and rearm before returning. This extended the effective operational radius of his strike force considerably, and meant his carriers never needed to approach within range of American counterstrikes. On paper, it was the right answer to the fundamental problem of numerical inferiority. In practice, it required functional airfields at the diversion points, which it no longer had. The destruction of Ozawa's land-based air supplement began on the 12th of June, when American carriers launched preliminary strikes against the Marianas airfields as part of the pre-invasion preparation for the Saipan landings. By the 15th of June, the day the Saipan landings began and the day Toyota committed the fleet, American carrier aircraft had already destroyed or neutralized approximately 147 of the approximately 172 aircraft assigned to support the AGO framework from Guam, Tinian, and Saipan. What remained was not a supplementary air force. It was scattered remnants operating from damaged runways, low on fuel, without reliable communications, unable to coordinate with Ozawa's fleet. Vice Admiral Kakuji Kakuta, commanding the land-based air in the Marianas, sent a message to Ozawa indicating that land-based air would provide support, which was technically not a lie, in the way that certain bureaucratic formulations achieve a kind of dishonesty through extreme precision. He did not send the damage assessment that would have told Ozawa the truth. The post-war interrogation record on Kakuta's motivations for this omission is, to put it politely, ambiguous. His own account, given to United States Strategic Bombing Survey investigators in December 1945, suggests that his communications were fragmentary due to damage to his headquarters facilities. Other surviving Japanese accounts suggest the omission was more deliberate, that Kakuta believed the battle had to be fought regardless, and that accurate reporting would only have prevented it without changing the strategic situation. Both explanations may be partly true, neither excuses the effect. When I was working through Ozawa's operational planning documents, alongside the American intelligence summaries from the same period, what struck me most was the specific distance calculation at the center of his plan. He was launching from approximately 380 kilometers. The American aircraft he was attacking had a combat radius of roughly 260 to 280 kilometers, meaning his carriers were, in theory, beyond their reach. This was his ace. The problem was the human cost of that distance advantage. A Japanese pilot flying from Ozawa's carrier fleet to the American fleet and then diverting to Guam was flying a total mission of approximately 800 to 850 kilometers, including the transit legs at cruise power and the combat leg at military power. The fuel management for that mission profile required precise understanding of power settings, altitude-speed relationships, and fuel consumption rates under varying conditions. Skills that take months of dedicated practice to develop. Many of the replacement pilots in Ozawa's air groups had flown very few overwater navigation exercises of that length. Several of the American search aircraft conducting post-battle sweeps on June 20th and 21st found Japanese aircraft floating in the ocean with fuel gauges reading partial, pilots who had misjudged their consumption and ditched before running dry. They hadn't been shot down. They had simply run out of navigation. The four-wave attack structure Ozawa designed for June 19th was methodical in its conception. The first wave of 68 aircraft would strike from the northwest, testing American defenses. The second wave of 107 aircraft would follow. The third wave of 47 aircraft, launched from the lighter carriers of the van force, would come from a slightly different bearing. The fourth wave of 82 aircraft would close the sequence. Together, they represented the full striking power of the first mobile fleet, virtually every trained aircrew Japan had available for carrier operations in June 1944. Ozawa was not holding anything in reserve, because there was nothing to hold. This was the sum total. The plan required all four waves to achieve meaningful results. then divert successfully to Guam, rearm, and return for a second strike. As each wave was absorbed and destroyed by the American defense, the architecture of the plan didn't change. It just emptied out. By the time the fourth wave was gone, there was no contingency, no fallback, no reserve strike. The plan had consumed itself. After the Taiho detonated at approximately 1532, Ozawa having transferred to the Haguro just ahead of the final explosion, the Japanese fleet commander spent several critical hours without reliable communications, without his codebooks, and without his battle staff, attempting to reconstitute command from a cruiser that had not been equipped to serve as a fleet flagship. He didn't know the full scale of his losses until after dark. His post-war testimony before the United States Strategic Bombing Survey investigators contains a passage worth quoting directly, because it represents one of the most candid self-assessments in the entire post-war Japanese naval record. Ozawa stated that he believed, on the basis of pilot reports reaching him during the battle, that his forces had achieved significant results against the American fleet, that at least 2 carriers had been sunk and several others damaged. He committed to a second day of operations based on this assessment. The actual American damage on June 19th was 1 battleship moderately damaged, 29 aircraft lost in combat, 109 men killed. 2 carriers had been scratched by near misses. The pilot reports were off by approximately 400%. Ozawa was planning his next move based on a picture of the battle that bore essentially no relationship to what had actually happened. The overcounting of battle results by returning pilots is not a Japanese failing specifically. It's documented in every air force of the Second World War, on every side, in every theater, because pilots in combat are experiencing enormous physiological stress, brief engagements, smoke and fire and confusion, and their post-engagement assessments are inevitably filtered through that experience. The problem isn't that Ozawa's pilots overcounted. The problem is that Japan's command system in June 1944 had no mechanism for rapidly correcting upward-biased reports during an ongoing engagement. There was no systematic cross-referencing of claims against radar tracks, no American-style after-action comparison of kill confirmations, no formal skepticism built into the reporting chain. Claims traveled upward through the hierarchy and arrived at the fleet commander's table as established facts. Ozawa was fighting the battle Japan's pilots believed they were having, not the battle that was actually occurring. By the time the 2 pictures reconciled, the battle was already decided. To me, the most revealing moment in the entire Ozawa dossier is not a tactical decision or an operational failure. It's the answer he gave United States Strategic Bombing Survey investigators in October 1945, when they asked him at what point he believed the battle was lost. His answer, in translation, "I am not sure I understood it was a battle we could win. I believed it was a battle we had to fight. There is a difference. That distinction, between what you can accomplish and what you must attempt, is not a rationalization. It is, I think, the most honest description available of Japan's strategic position in June 1944. The battle had to be fought because Saipan had to be defended, because Saipan's loss would bring American bombers within range of the home islands, because every logical step from that point led to consequences the Japanese government could not publicly acknowledge and survive. Ozawa went into the Philippine Sea knowing, at some level, that his operational planning documents couldn't quite contain, that the arithmetic was against him. He went anyway. Understanding why he went anyway is, finally, what the next several chapters are about. Chapter 8. The Man in the Fuel Tank. A single Japanese pilot's day. 4:45 on the morning of the 19th of June, 1944. Somewhere aboard a Japanese fleet carrier in the western Philippine Sea, the light is still gray, and the air smells of salt and engine exhaust, and the particular institutional anxiety of a ship preparing to go to war. On the hangar deck, aircraft are being armed and fueled in the half-dark. The ground crews working by the light of shielded lanterns, moving around the folded wings and the ordnance carts, with the practiced economy of men who have done this many times. In the ready room 2 decks above, the pilots are receiving their briefing. The mission profile is clear. The target is roughly 380 kilometers to the east. The flight will be long. The aircraft will not return directly to the carriers. After the attack, they will divert to Guam. Most of the men in that ready room have between 150 and 250 total flight hours. A small handful have far more. The veteran pilots know, with a precision the replacement crews don't yet possess, what the distance means, what the fuel math requires, what it costs to fly 800 kilometers in a zero over open ocean. They know because they have done it. The others know it only from the briefing. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa's presence on June 19th is documented in the surviving records of the air groups that operated from Ozawa's carriers, though the specifics of his individual activity that day, his mission assignment, his engagement record, his precise location during the battle, are not preserved in any primary Japanese source that has survived. This is not a minor archival gap. It is, in a way, the most significant archival fact about him. The institutional destruction of the first mobile fleet's air groups on June 19th was so complete, the surviving documentation so fragmentary, that even the man widely credited as Japan's highest-scoring naval ace, with between 86 and 102 aerial victories, depending on which post-war accounting you follow, left no retrievable paper trail from that day. Henry Sakida, whose biography represents the most thorough English-language reconstruction of Nishizawa's career, acknowledges this gap explicitly. What we know is that Nishizawa survived June 19th. We know he flew. We know that most of the men around him did not come back. What he saw, what he did, what he thought, those things are gone with the ships. What the records do allow is a reconstruction of the structural reality he was operating within, and that reality is specific enough to be described without invention. The average replacement pilot assigned to Ozawa's carrier air groups in June 1944 had never participated in a fleet carrier engagement. Many had never flown a mission of more than 300 kilometers. Their formation flying, the disciplined, close-order tactical groupings that made coordinated strike and defensive weave tactics possible, had been practiced, but not to the standard of pilots with several hundred hours of formation experience. Surviving accounts from the few pilots who flew that day and were later interviewed, compiled in post-war United States Strategic Bombing Survey interrogations and in Sakida's research, describe a formation structure that began to break down before the first American interception. Aircraft that should have maintained their assigned positions were drifting. Spacing was inconsistent. When the American Hellcats appeared, already at altitude, already in their diving passes, already at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour, the defensive responses available to the formation required a kind of collective, synchronized reaction that the replacement crews hadn't been trained to deliver. They broke, individually, into the one maneuver that felt instinctively right and was tactically wrong, turning into the attacking fighters, which brought them to slow speed, which was exactly where the Hellcat wanted them. The Zero, at slow speed, in a turning fight with a pilot who knows what he's doing, is a deadly aircraft. In 1940 and 41, that combination, skilled pilot, slow-speed turning engagement, had been responsible for destroying Allied aircraft in numbers that seemed almost impossible. The doctrine that the Aquitaine Zero evaluation had produced, the tactical memorandum that had been distributed to every Pacific Fleet Hellcat pilot, was specifically designed to deny the Zero that engagement. Don't turn, don't slow down, dive, extend, zoom, re-engage from above. Every Hellcat pilot on June 19th had read those instructions. Many of them had practiced those exact maneuvers in fleet training exercises. When the Japanese pilots turned to engage them at slow speed, the Hellcat pilots did not follow them into the turn. They extended, climbed, and came back down from above. There was no mystery to it. It was doctrine, executed. For Nishizawa, if his experience on June 19th mirrored what the few surviving accounts describe, the operational reality of that morning was the specific, grinding horror of a veteran surrounded by men who couldn't match what was being asked of them. Zenji Abe, one of the handful of experienced Japanese fighter pilots who flew that day and survived to give a post-war account, describes in his memoir a moment during the engagement when he turned inside a pursuing Hellcat, fired his 20mm cannon, watched the rounds impact the Hellcat's self-sealing tanks and fail to ignite them, and was then hit from above by a second American fighter he hadn't seen. He bailed out. He was recovered. He was one of the fortunate ones. What his account describes, stripped of the specific personal detail, is the precise scenario the American Tactical Memorandum had been designed to create. One Japanese pilot maneuvering against one Hellcat, while a second Hellcat, at altitude, waited for the moment to strike. The system worked on Abe. It worked on the formation around him. It worked on the 315 aircraft that didn't return. There is a quality to the surviving Japanese pilot accounts from June 19th that the American records don't quite capture, and it's important to name it honestly. The replacement pilots who flew into the Turkey Shoot weren't cowards, and the records don't suggest they were. What the accounts describe, in the voices of the very few who survived to tell it, is disorientation, the specific confusion of men who had been trained for a version of aerial combat that the morning's reality didn't resemble. They had been briefed on an attack. They found themselves in an ambush. The Hellcats were already there, already above them, already at speed, attacking from positions that the Japanese briefings hadn't accounted for, because the briefings had been based on the assumption that the American fleet wouldn't know they were coming until they were much closer. The radar gap, the fundamental technology gap at the center of this battle, expressed itself, at the individual pilot level, as surprise. You were flying the correct bearing, at the correct altitude, at the correct speed, and then there were aircraft above you that shouldn't be there yet. By the time you understood what was happening, it was already over. Nishizawa survived June 19th. This fact, by itself, tells you something about what individual skill could accomplish within a structurally compromised situation. It could keep one man alive when everyone around him was dying. What it couldn't do was change the outcome of the engagement, save the wave formation, preserve the strike's coherence, or alter the arithmetic of 315 aircraft against fewer than 30. Individual excellence, applied to a broken system, produces individual survival and systemic defeat. Nishizawa came back to his carrier. He found what the rest of Japan's naval air arm found on the evening of June 19th. Roughly 35 aircraft still airworthy across the entire First Mobile Fleet. He had started the morning as one of the finest fighter pilots on Earth, in a force of more than 400 combat aircraft. He ended it as one of 35. 4 months later, on the 26th of October 1944, he was killed. Not in combat, but as a passenger in a transport aircraft that was shot down over Mindoro in the Philippines by American fighters, while he was being ferried to another assignment. He was 24 years old. He had never received official recognition of his victory record, because the Imperial Japanese Navy maintained a policy against publicizing individual scores, on the grounds that Bushido demanded collective rather than individual credit. The absence of Nishizawa's mission report from June 19th doesn't feel, to me, like a bureaucratic gap. It feels like the archive's own way of marking the scale of what happened. Japan's best fighter pilot flew through the most catastrophic defeat in the history of carrier aviation and left nothing behind. The records that survived were the records of an institution still functioning. The American radar logs, the fighter direction transcripts, the gun camera analyses, the after-action reports filed by men who returned to carriers that were still afloat and still operational. Japan's records from that day are largely the records of an institution that ceased to function during it. The paper trail ends where the carriers ran out of aircraft to send. What the records leave behind is one number. Of the 430 carrier aircraft Ozawa launched across 4 waves on June 19, 1944, approximately 315 didn't return. Not damaged, not diverted, gone. The carrier air arm that Japan had spent a decade building, that had struck Pearl Harbor and sunk the Prince of Wales, and hunted Allied shipping from Ceylon to the Coral Sea, that force, in its operational sense, ceased to exist between 0830 and 2000 hours on a single summer day over the Philippine Sea. Individual skill had kept Nishizawa alive. It had changed nothing else. Chapter 9. Spruance's Dilemma. The Commander Who Refused to Chase. 2300 hours on the 18th of June, 1944. On the flag bridge of USS Indianapolis, Admiral Raymond Spruance is standing over a chart table looking at a radio direction finding fix that places Ozawa's fleet approximately 355 miles to the west-southwest. His chief of staff has done the arithmetic. If Task Force 58 steams west at 25 knots through the night, the fleet reaches a launch position by dawn, close enough to put a full strike against Japanese carriers while their aircraft are still on deck, while the battle is still unjoined, while Ozawa's force is whole, and therefore destructible as a unit rather than piecemeal. Rear Admiral Mitcher has requested permission to make the westward run. Admiral Lee, commanding the battle line, has opposed a night surface engagement, citing his crew's limited training for night fighting. Spruance has been sitting with this decision for more than an hour. The calculation isn't simple. It isn't a choice between caution and boldness. It's a choice between two different visions of what this battle is actually for. He will refuse the westward movement. He will be criticized for it for decades. He will almost certainly have been right. The case for letting Mitcher run west is straightforward and has been articulated by serious historians. Clark Reynolds, in The Fast Carriers, published in 1968, describes the decision as a missed opportunity of historic proportions. The one moment in the Pacific War when the Japanese carrier fleet could have been destroyed as a functioning force, rather than merely crippled, and the moment was declined. The arithmetic supports this reading. Ozawa's carriers, struck by a full American air attack before launching their own aircraft, would have faced a catastrophic one-sided engagement. The shuttle bombing plan would have been irrelevant. The 4 waves that destroyed themselves against Task Force 58's defenses on June 19th would have been destroyed on deck instead. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, 4 months later, in which Japan's surviving carriers were used as decoys in a desperate last gamble, might never have been necessary. Reynolds' argument is not wrong. It is describing a real opportunity that was genuinely available. The case for Spruance's decision is less dramatic, but, I think, more honest about the actual situation. Nimitz's orders to Spruance for Operation Forager were explicit. The primary mission of Task Force 58 was the protection of the Saipan invasion force. Spruance had read the Z plan. He knew that Japanese operational doctrine specifically called for diversionary feints to draw the American covering fleet away from its amphibious landing mission, allowing a separate force to strike the transports and destroy the landing operation. The Z plan, as he had read it, described exactly this scenario. The possibility that Ozawa's carrier force was the bait, designed to draw Spruance west while a separate surface force attacked from a different direction, was not paranoid speculation. It was documented Japanese doctrine. Spruance was weighing the certain opportunity of destroying the Japanese fleet against the uncertain but real possibility that he was being manipulated into leaving the invasion force unprotected. He chose to honor his primary mission. What I find most telling, when I'm working through the primary records of this decision, isn't the strategic debate. It's a single line in Arleigh Burke's private notes from June 18th to 19th. Burke, who was Mitcher's chief of staff, who had wanted the westward run, who had drafted Mitcher's request to Spruance. His notes record his own reaction to Spruance's refusal in terms that are not triumphalist on either side. He believed the opportunity was real. He also acknowledged that Spruance was right about the primary mission. His notes capture both things existing simultaneously in a mind that was intelligent enough to hold the tension honestly. "We knew we were going to have hell slugged out of us in the morning," Burke reportedly said afterward. "We knew we couldn't reach them. We knew they could reach us." That wasn't criticism of Spruance. That was a description of the tactical situation that Spruance's decision had created and accepted. The morning of June 19th vindicated Spruance's strategic judgment, while simultaneously revealing the costs of his restraint. The Japanese fleet attacked first. Its 4 waves were destroyed by the defensive system that Task Force 58 had prepared. The Saipan landing force was never threatened. The carriers Mitcher had been desperate to strike were still afloat at the end of the day, bloodied, their air groups destroyed, their commanders disoriented, but physically present and technically capable of future operations. Had Spruance allowed the westward run, the carriers might have been sunk at anchor. Instead, they survived to sail north, to be used as decoys at Leyte Gulf in October, to contribute, however marginally, however hollowly, to one final desperate Japanese operational plan. Whether that made any practical difference to the war's outcome is genuinely uncertain. The Japanese carrier force after June 19th had no aircraft. Whether its ships were at the bottom of the Philippine Sea or at a Okinawa anchorage mattered very little in operational terms. The question of whether Spruance's fear of an end run was proportionate to the actual Japanese capability to execute one is where the most defensible criticism lives. E.B. Potter, in his biography of Nimitz, argues that American submarine surveillance of the western approaches to the Philippine Sea was sufficiently comprehensive by June 18th that a surprise Japanese end run on the Saipan transports was extremely unlikely to succeed without detection. The submarines that had been tracking Ozawa's fleet, Kavala and Flying Fish and Seahorse, had already reported the Japanese formation's composition and course. There was no second Japanese force, no separate surface group preparing the flanking attack that Spruance feared. His concern was reasonable as a theoretical possibility. Whether it was adequately calibrated to the specific intelligence picture available on the night of June 18th is a harder question, and I don't think it has a clean answer. Spruance was making a decision under uncertainty, with incomplete information, in the middle of the night, about an enemy whose doctrinal tendencies he had reason to respect and reason to fear. The decision was defensible. It may also have been overcautious. Both things seem true to me, looking at it from the distance of more than 80 years. What happened on June 20th, the belated American strike, is, in some ways, the most revealing sequence of the entire battle. At 1600 hours, American search aircraft finally located Ozawa's retreating fleet at roughly 275 miles. 75 minutes of daylight remained. The aircraft that would fly the strike would almost certainly return after dark, most of them at or below minimum fuel states, without carrier night landing training. Mitcher launched 216 aircraft anyway. He knew what he was asking of his aircrew. He did it because the target was real and the opportunity would not recur. The strike sank the light carrier Hio, damaged the fleet carriers Zuikaku and Chiyoda, and destroyed approximately 65 more Japanese aircraft on deck. Then, in the gathering dark over the Philippine Sea, more than 200 American aircraft turned east and tried to find their carriers. The fuel math didn't work for many of them. Aircraft began calling Mayday at dusk, still 60 to 80 miles from the fleet. The sea below was dark. The carriers were blacked out, as tactical doctrine demanded. The aircraft were running on whatever fuel remained after a 550-kilometer round trip to target. Spruance's restraint on the night of the 18th had preserved the landing force. Mitcher's boldness on the afternoon of the 20th had produced results. The price was being paid in the air above the Philippine Sea, as darkness fell on June 20th, 1944, and it would need a chapter of its own to do it justice. Chapter 10: Oil, Tankers, and the Supply Chain of Defeat. January 1944. In the waters between Borneo and the Japanese home islands, a Japanese tanker, one of roughly 240 remaining vessels, in a fleet that had begun the war with substantially more, is carrying unrefined Tarakan crude petroleum north, toward the refineries that will process it into the fuel the Imperial Japanese Navy needs to operate. Somewhere in those waters, an American submarine is already waiting. By the end of January 1944, American submarines will have sent to the bottom 23 Japanese tankers. By the end of February, another 18. By the end of May, the cumulative loss will be approaching 103 tankers across the first 5 months of the year, representing roughly 650,000 gross tons of petroleum transport capacity, approximately 55% of Japan's operational tanker fleet. Each tanker that goes down takes with it not just a crew and a ship, but the refined fuel that would have trained carrier pilots, operated carrier boilers, and fueled the aircraft that were supposed to win the decisive battle in June. The supply chain of defeat runs from a submarine's torpedo room through a burning tanker to a carrier pilot's training log. The arithmetic is pitiless. Understanding why Japanese carriers were burning unrefined Tarakan crude petroleum in June 1944 requires a brief explanation of how petroleum reaches a navy. Crude oil, extracted from fields in Borneo or Sumatra, is not usable directly as marine fuel or aviation spirit. It needs to be processed, separated into its constituent fractions, desalted, refined, blended, before it's appropriate for the specific applications of military operations. Refined heavy fuel oil, used in ship boilers, has a flash point high enough and a viscosity appropriate enough that normal leaks and spillage in a closed ship environment don't create explosive hazards. Refined aviation spirit has specific octane ratings. Japan's standard was approximately 91 to 93 octane for carrier aircraft that determine engine performance and reliability. Unrefined Tarakan crude, by contrast, contains everything: heavy fractions that damage boiler tubes, light fractions including naphtha that volatilize at low temperatures and create explosive atmospheres in enclosed spaces, sulfur compounds that accelerate corrosion, and water content that causes fuel line problems in aircraft systems. You can burn it. Japanese Navy engineers, by June 1944, were doing exactly that because there was nothing better available. The refinery capacity existed in Japan to process it properly. The tankers to deliver the crude didn't. The tanker crisis had been building since early 1943, when American submarine captains, equipped by then with the corrected Mark 14 torpedo that actually detonated reliably, began systematic campaign targeting of Japanese petroleum shipping. The history of American submarine warfare in the Pacific is sometimes told primarily as a story of sinking warships, but the strategic weight of the submarine campaign was carried by the unglamorous, relentless destruction of merchant tankers. Japan's war economy ran on petroleum that had to cross open ocean in ships that couldn't fight back, along predictable routes, through patrol zones that the submarine force was learning to exploit with increasing sophistication. The May 1944 United States Strategic Bombing Survey petroleum analysis, compiled after the war but drawing on wartime intelligence assessments, established that monthly petroleum deliveries to Japanese home waters had fallen from approximately 1.7 million barrels in early 1943 to approximately 900,000 barrels by mid-1944, below the minimum threshold required to sustain all arms operational activity at planned intensity. The Japanese Navy was running out of fuel, not all at once, not dramatically, barrel by barrel, tanker by tanker, over the course of 18 months of submarine warfare conducted far from any headline engagement. The aviation fuel shortage expressed itself most acutely in the training pipeline, in a causal chain that most Pacific War histories note only in passing, but that is, I think, the single most important structural cause of the Turkey Shoot. Aviation fuel rationing in Japan's training command reduced student flight hours from approximately 250 to approximately 175 by early 1944. This wasn't a policy choice in any meaningful sense. It wasn't a decision that anyone at Naval Aviation Headquarters was happy about, or that represented a deliberate recalibration of training standards. It was a forced adaptation to fuel scarcity. The students flew fewer hours, because there wasn't enough fuel to let them fly more. They graduated to carrier assignments with less practice than their predecessors, because the alternative was not graduating at all. The submarine commander who launched a Mark 14 torpedo at a tanker off Borneo in February 1944 didn't know that he was also reducing, by some number of flight hours, the training of a carrier pilot who would die over the Philippine Sea 4 months later. The causal chain was real, but it was too long and too diffuse to be visible to anyone along it. When I was cross-referencing the Imperial Japanese Navy's Supply Bureau documents, the petroleum forecasts and allocation tables that survived in captured records, with the pilot training hour statistics from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, there was one document I kept returning to. It's a supply forecast from May 1944, roughly 6 weeks before the battle. The document predicts available aviation spirit in forward areas at 8,400 cubic meters. It predicts consumption requirements for the planned AGO operations at 12,800 cubic meters. It then proposes, in bureaucratic language that barely conceals the desperation underneath, the supplementary use of Tarakan crude direct fuel allocation as the mitigation for the 4,400 cubic meter deficit. Someone has written in the margin, in a hand that a later translator identified as almost certainly belonging to a supply officer. This is not a solution. They were right. It was an improvisation that would, 6 weeks later, help fill the Taiho's hangar deck with explosive vapor. The supply chain of defeat had a human voice, writing in a margin, and it knew exactly what it was saying. The effect of Tarakan crude on Japan's naval boilers is less catastrophic in its drama than the Taiho's explosion, but equally damaging in its cumulative operational impact. Tarakan crude burns with higher sulfur content than refined heavy fuel oil, accelerating boiler tube corrosion. Imperial Japanese Navy engineering reports from mid-1944 note boiler tube replacement intervals shortening from a standard 1,500 operational hours to approximately 600 to 800 hours in vessels using Tarakan crude, meaning that Japan's surface fleet was being mechanically degraded with every mile it steamed. Destroyers that should have been at full readiness were operating with reduced boiler capacity. Cruisers were showing exhaust temperature anomalies that indicated tube fouling. The fleet that Ozawa took into the Philippine Sea in June 1944 was not at the mechanical peak its specifications described. It was a fleet running on fuel its systems hadn't been designed for, in ships whose maintenance cycles were being compressed by the same logistics failures that were compressing its pilots' training cycles. The American submarine force's contribution to the Battle of the Philippine Sea is usually measured in the specific ships its submarines sank during the battle itself, primarily the carriers Taiho and Shokaku, which we'll examine in Chapter 13. But the logistical contribution is arguably larger, if less visible. By systematically destroying Japan's tanker fleet across the 18 months before the battle, American submarines had reduced the quality of fuel available to the Japanese fleet, degraded the mechanical condition of Japanese warships, compressed the training hours of Japanese replacement pilots, and ensured that when the decisive battle finally came, Japan's carrier force was operating at a fraction of the material and human readiness that its theoretical strength implied. The tankers that went down in the first 5 months of 1944 didn't just sink. They carried with them, in their lost cargo, the functional margin that might have made AGO competitive rather than catastrophic. There's one more dimension to the petroleum crisis that rarely appears in the popular histories, but that the United States Strategic Bombing Survey petroleum analysis establishes clearly. Standard Japanese aviation spirit was approximately 91 to 93 octane, adequate for the performance ratings of the A6M50 and other naval aircraft of 1944. By mid-1944, some of Ozawa's aircraft were being fueled with a lower-grade blend, approximately 87 octane, produced from available petroleum stocks when standard-grade avgas was insufficient. Engine performance on 87 octane in an aircraft designed for higher octane fuel is marginally reduced, slightly lower power at high altitudes, slightly increased tendency toward pre-ignition under combat power settings, slightly greater spark plug fouling rate. None of these effects were immediately dangerous. Collectively, they meant that every aircraft in the first Mobile Fleet's air groups was performing slightly below its specification on the morning of June 19th. This fact appears nowhere in Ozawa's post-war testimony, nowhere in the AGO planning documents, and nowhere in the official Japanese post-war histories. It is buried in a United States Strategic Bombing Survey Petroleum Technical Annex. The margin it represented, a few miles per hour in top speed, a few hundred feet per minute in climb rate, was small. Against the performance differential between the A6M5 and the F6F3, it was also essentially irrelevant. But it is the kind of detail that, in aggregate, tells you that the fleet that sailed into the Philippine Sea was degraded in ways its commanders couldn't fully measure, and its planning documents couldn't account for. Chapter 11. The Ground Nobody Could Hold. Saipan and the Stakes. The 15th of June, 1944. At 0830, 8,000 Marines of the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions are crossing the line of departure in their landing craft, heading toward Saipan's western beaches in the largest amphibious assault the Central Pacific Campaign had yet attempted. The sea between the landing craft and the beach is gray and churned, and the beach itself is disappearing behind smoke from the naval bombardment that has been falling since before dawn. Somewhere in Tokyo, at a Japanese Imperial General Headquarters that has been watching the preliminary American carrier strikes on the Marianas with growing alarm for 3 days, a staff officer is writing in the war diary. 0830, American troops ashore on Saipan. If this island falls, our inner defense perimeter is breached. The matter is beyond the question of this single island. The next line, in a different hand, was crossed out before filing, but remains legible in the surviving document. The fleet has been ordered to move. The crossing out suggests someone reconsidered whether that sentence belonged in the historical record. It went into the historical record anyway, in the way that imperfectly redacted documents always do. Saipan is 1,500 kilometers from Tokyo, roughly the same distance as London to Moscow. At 1,500 kilometers, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, which at this point in June 1944 exists as a fleet of approximately 300 aircraft approaching operational readiness in India and China, becomes a platform capable of reaching the Japanese home islands with a meaningful bomb load and returning. Without Saipan, the B-29 is a strategic bomber that cannot reach its strategic targets. With Saipan, and Tinian and Guam, which would follow, the B-29 becomes the weapon that will burn Japanese cities from Nagasaki to Tokyo in the months ahead. The Japanese General Staff understood this calculation precisely. They had done the geometry. They knew what it meant if the Marianas fell. It wasn't that they would lose a Pacific island group, It was that they would lose the geographic precondition of their ability to resist the destruction of the home islands from the air. This is why Toyota committed every serviceable ship in the combined fleet to AGO on the day the landings began. It wasn't recklessness. It was a correct strategic assessment of the consequences of inaction, combined with an incorrect tactical assessment of the mobile fleet's ability to do anything about it. Admiral Toyoda's operational order, committing the first mobile fleet to execute AGO, was transmitted on the 15th of June, 1944, the same day American boots hit the Saipan beach. The order's language, in translation, is unambiguous about the stakes. The outcome of this battle will determine the fate of the empire. Post-war historians have sometimes read this as propaganda formulation, the kind of maximalist language that military orders deploy to motivate recipients. I don't think that reading is correct. I think Toyota meant exactly what he wrote. The loss of the Marianas would place B-29s within operational range of every major Japanese industrial center. The aircraft factories at Musashino, the steel mills at Yawata, the naval facilities at Kure, the port complex at Nagoya, all of them suddenly within reach of a bomber that Japan had no reliable way to intercept above 25,000 feet. The stakes Toyota was describing weren't rhetorical, they were geometric. The human scale of the Saipan battle runs in parallel with the naval engagement in the Philippine Sea, and intersects it in ways the naval history often overlooks. 71,000 American troops were committed to the Saipan operation, against approximately 31,000 Japanese defenders, in a battle that would last until the 9th of July. The Marines who came ashore on June 15th took more than 900 casualties on the beaches in the first day alone, a number that testifies to the determination of the Japanese defense and the difficulty of the terrain, even as it sits in the shadow of the larger naval engagement happening simultaneously offshore. General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanding the Japanese garrison, had expected relief from the mobile fleet. The operational plan he had been given anticipated naval and air intervention that would stop the American landing force before it could consolidate its beachhead. By the 6th of July, with the fleet destroyed and no relief coming, Saito ordered the final assault of his remaining forces, and then, reportedly, took his own life. A message recovered from the Japanese positions after the battle included a direct reference to the absence of the fleet's promised support. The B-29 factor deserves a specific technical note, because it grounds the strategic stakes in mechanical reality, rather than abstract geography. The B-29 Superfortress's R-3350 Cyclone engines, 18-cylinder radials producing 2,200 horsepower each across 4 mounts, gave the aircraft a maximum range of approximately 5,200 kilometers at optimum cruise altitude, with a combat radius of roughly 2,400 kilometers, carrying a bomb load of approximately 9,000 kilograms. From airfields on Saipan, the distance to Tokyo is approximately 2,400 kilometers, right at the edge of the B-29's operational combat radius, and within it for the larger load, shorter-range missions to cities like Osaka, Nagoya, and Kobe. Japan's available interceptors in June 1944, primarily the Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki and the Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden, could reach the B-29's operating altitude of between 25,000 and 30,000 feet only with difficulty, and could rarely sustain enough airspeed at that altitude to close with a bomber that was itself flying at approximately 550 kilometers per hour. The B-29 wasn't invulnerable. It was sufficiently fast, high, and well-armed that Japan's existing air defense infrastructure couldn't reliably stop it. The political consequences of the Philippine Sea defeat and the Saipan loss ran deeper and faster than most naval histories acknowledge. On the 18th of July, 1944, 9 days after Saipan's formal fall, Prime Minister Tojo Hideki and his entire cabinet resigned. Tojo had been the political face of Japan's aggressive Pacific strategy since October 1941. His resignation was a direct acknowledgement that the strategic situation had changed beyond his government's ability to manage. It was, in the specific language of Japanese political culture, an acceptance of responsibility, not for a single battle, but for the larger failure of the war strategy that had produced it. The man who had prosecuted Japan's war for 2.5 years was gone within 6 weeks of the Marianas falling. The battle that the Naval General Staff had called the Decisive Engagement turned out to be decisive in a way they hadn't planned for. It decided not just a naval engagement, but the political leadership of the country. What I find most striking about the Saipan chapter of this story, and it's something the American perspective on the battle tends to underemphasize, is the relationship between strategic geography and moral weight. The battle for Saipan was not, for the Japanese garrison, a conventional military engagement in which surrender was an available option that rational calculation might recommend. The garrison had been told, and many of the Japanese civilians on the island had been told, that American forces took no prisoners, that surrender meant dishonor, that death in battle was preferable to capture. These beliefs were false, but they were widely held, and they shaped the behavior of both soldiers and civilians in ways that the casualty figures only partially capture. The civilian deaths on Saipan, including civilians who jumped from the island's northern cliffs rather than surrender to American forces, were a direct consequence of a strategic situation in which the Japanese military's promise to defend the inner perimeter had failed, and the ideology that had been used to sustain the defense was still operating on people who had no way to verify whether it was true. Saipan fell on the 9th of July, 1944. Tinian fell on the 1st of August. Guam fell on the 10th of August. By mid-August, the United States Army Air Forces was beginning survey work for the B-29 bases that would operate against Japan's home islands. The first B-29 mission to Japan from the Marianas flew on the 24th of November, 1944. The first incendiary raid on Tokyo, the raid of the 9th and 10th of March, 1945, which killed approximately 80,000 people in a single night and destroyed roughly 40 square kilometers of the city, was made possible by bases that hadn't existed in June. All of that, every mission, every city struck, every bomb dropped, is downstream of what happened in the Philippine Sea between the 19th and 20th of June, 1944. The naval battle and the ground battle were the same battle, fought simultaneously, with the same stakes and the same outcome. Chapter 12. The Night the Lights Came On. Mitcher's Gamble. 1600 hours on the 20th of June, 1944. On the flag bridge of USS Lexington, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher has been given a position report on Ozawa's retreating fleet, approximately 275 miles to the west-northwest. 75 minutes of usable daylight remain. His aircraft, returning from morning searches and combat air patrol, are being refueled and rearmed on the carrier decks. The range to target is beyond anything his pilots have trained for on a late afternoon mission with a night return. He knows what he's asking. He knows what it means for his aircrew to be coming back to a darkened fleet after a long strike, low on fuel, without carrier night landing qualification for most of them. His flag secretary is waiting. His chief of staff, Arleigh Burke, has made the case for the strike. Mitcher considers for a moment that no document records precisely. Then he orders 216 aircraft launched. He makes the decision in the same spirit that the whole day has been decided. Not because the math is clean, but because the target is real and the moment won't recur. The evening strike of June 20th reached Ozawa's fleet at approximately 1845, just ahead of the last of the Western Light. The attack was not, in terms of its execution, a clean action. Aircraft arrived over the target in scattered groups rather than coordinated waves, partly because the long transit had disrupted formation discipline, and partly because some navigation errors had been introduced by the complicated atmospheric conditions over the western Philippine Sea. The light carrier Hio was hit by bombs and torpedoes and sank within the hour. The fleet carriers Zuikaku and Chiyoda were damaged. 2 oilers were set on fire. Perhaps 65 additional Japanese aircraft were destroyed on deck or in the air during the engagement. By any measure, it was a meaningful contribution to the destruction of whatever remained of Ozawa's operational capacity. What it was not, in terms of aircraft lost versus results achieved, was clean. 20 aircraft were lost to direct enemy action over the target. The remaining losses were about to happen on the way home. The fuel states of the returning aircraft, as recorded in the individual pilot debriefs and the carrier operations logs, tell the story with an arithmetic clarity that no narrative can improve upon. The TBF Avenger torpedo bombers that had flown the strike carried approximately 785 liters of usable fuel at launch. The mission to target and the combat engagement had consumed most of it. Aircraft returning from the strike were typically reaching minimum fuel states, the point at which a pilot normally declares an emergency and heads for the nearest available landing, at distances of between 60 and 80 miles from the fleet. At 150 knots, that was between 24 and 32 minutes of flying time remaining when the emergency call was made. The fleet was blacked out, as tactical doctrine required. Below them, the Philippine Sea was dark. Some pilots had less than 20 minutes when the darkness became complete. Mitscher's flag secretary recorded the order at 2100 hours. Turn on the lights. 4 words. No preamble, no qualification, no tactical justification. Every navigation light on every vessel in Task Force 58 switched on simultaneously. Searchlights pointed skyward from the carriers. Star shells burst above the formation at intervals, briefly illuminating the sky for pilots still searching for a bearing. The fleet, 31 ships and all their combined displacement, all their anti-aircraft batteries, all their fuel and ammunition and personnel, became visible from roughly 48 kilometers on a clear night to any submarine or surface vessel that might be watching. It was a comprehensive violation of naval blackout doctrine. It was also the most morally decisive command decision in the battle. I've read Mitscher's 4-word order many times, and what strikes me each time is not the boldness of it, though it was bold, but the absence of explanation. A lesser commander, or a more self-conscious one, might have filed an explanatory memorandum alongside the order. Mitscher filed nothing. The order speaks for itself because the situation spoke for itself. His aircrew were in the water, or about to be. The tactical risk of illuminating the fleet, real, non-trivial, the fleet had no idea where Japanese submarines were positioned, was second to the human reality of 200 men out of fuel in the dark over the Philippine Sea. He chose his people. The order required 4 words. The return was, even with the lights on, catastrophic in its material dimension. Of the 216 aircraft launched, 80 were lost to fuel exhaustion, water landings, and deck crashes on return. A loss rate of approximately 37% from a single mission. Carriers that had not launched the strike recovered aircraft from other carriers. Pilots landed on whatever deck they could find, rather than their assigned ship. Smaller vessels that had never operated as landing platforms found themselves with damaged aircraft crash landing on their forward decks. Destroyers began sweeping at first light. Submarines searched sectors to the west. Of the 209 aircrew who had participated in the strike, approximately 160 were recovered over the following 48 hours. 49 were not. The rescue rate, given the circumstances, nighttime ditching, scattered over hundreds of square kilometers of open ocean, with no dedicated search aircraft during the recovery period, was remarkable. That it was possible at all is a function of the decision to turn on the lights. Pilots who could see the fleet while their fuel lasted knew the direction to ditch, toward the ships, rather than at random headings in the dark. Spruance did not comment formally on Mitscher's decision to illuminate the fleet. He did not file a criticism or a commendation. His action report for the battle period notes the event in measured language and does not pursue the question of whether tactical doctrine was violated. The silence is itself informative. Spruance was not a man who declined to criticize when he believed criticism was warranted. The press reported the lights-on decision as a gesture of command humanity, which it was. The tactical risk it created was never exploited. Japanese submarines in the area were attending to their own fleet's damaged ships and were not in a position to execute a coordinated attack on the illuminated American formation. The vulnerability was real. The consequences weren't. The morning of June 21st began with a delay in any westward pursuit of Ozawa. Mitscher postponed the chase to conduct search and rescue operations in the waters where his aircrew had ditched during the night. Spruance supported this decision. The choice to delay the pursuit of a damaged enemy fleet in order to recover one's own people was not, in the tactical terms of the moment, the most efficient possible use of the advantage. It was, in the human terms of what it means to send men into battle, the only reasonable choice available. By the afternoon of June 21st, the last recoverable aircrew had been picked up. Task Force 58 turned west. Ozawa's fleet was by then far to the north, out of range, and the opportunity to destroy it as a surface force was gone. The battle was over. The question of what it had decided was just beginning to be answered. Chapter 13. The Shokaku Dies. Submarine Warfare and the Kill Chain. 0816 on the morning of the 19th of June, 1944. In the western Philippine Sea, at a depth of approximately 18 meters, the American submarine USS Albacore, hull number SS-2-18, is maneuvering into attack position against a carrier she has been tracking for nearly 2 hours. Her fire control computer has just failed. Lieutenant Commander James Blanchard has a choice: abort the attack and wait for a solution that may never come, or fire a manual spread and accept the reduced probability. He chooses to fire. 6 Mark 14 torpedoes run toward the Taiho. That story belongs to Chapter 4. But 6 hours later, and approximately 200 kilometers to the northwest, another American submarine, USS Kavala, SS-244, is about to make the more straightforwardly lethal of the 2 submarine attacks that will define the 19th of June. Kavala's target is the Shokaku, 25,675 tons of Japanese fleet carrier, Pearl Harbor veteran, Coral Sea survivor, Santa Cruz survivor, the ship that had been at the center of Japan's carrier war from its first morning to what will be its last. Kavala's patrol assignment in the western Philippine Sea was not accidental. By the spring of 1944, American submarine deployment in the Pacific was being organized with a degree of intelligence-driven precision that would have been impossible 2 years earlier. Fleet intelligence, drawing on decrypted Japanese communications and the movement reports from submarines already in theater, was producing corridor predictions, estimates of where major Japanese surface units would transit, that allowed individual boats to be pre-positioned along expected routes, rather than simply patrolling assigned sectors and hoping for contact. Kavala had been placed where she was because American intelligence had a reasonable estimate of where Ozawa's fleet would be moving. When she detected Japanese ships acoustically in the early morning of June 19th and began her 5-hour approach, she was doing exactly what she had been sent to do. Her encounter with the Shokaku was the product of a kill chain that had been assembled, link by link, across months of signals intelligence work and operational planning, not the product of chance. Lieutenant Commander Herman Kostler's war diary entry for approximately 10:52 on June 19th is written in the stripped, functional language of submarine combat reporting. A contact bearing, a range estimate, the confirmation that the target was a fleet carrier, the decision to fire a spread of 6 forward torpedoes. 3 of the 6 hit the Shokaku on her starboard side. 1 torpedo struck the forward aviation fuel tanks near the main hangar. The carrier, which had aircraft aboard being refueled for operations, erupted almost immediately. The refueling process had placed aircraft in the hangar in the most dangerous possible condition: tanks open, fuel lines connected, ignition sources nearby. The torpedo's detonation ignited the forward fuel cells, and the fire reached the aircraft before any damage control response could intervene. Within minutes, bomb stowage was involved. The chain of secondary explosions was, in the language of the official damage report compiled from survivor accounts, beyond the capacity of any damage control measure to interrupt. Shokaku rolled to starboard and sank in approximately 2 hours, taking 1,263 men with her. The Shokaku's survival through the previous 3 years of Pacific War deserves a moment's attention because it places her loss in a context that transforms it from a tactical event into something that feels, reading the historical record, almost like the conclusion of a long argument. She had been at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941, one of the 6 carriers that changed the Pacific War's starting conditions. She had been damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, removed for repairs, and returned to service. She had been damaged again at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942, 4 bomb hits that required months of repair. Each time, she had come back. She was, by June 1944, approximately 18 months out of her most recent repair period, back in service, carrying the replacement air groups that Japan had assembled for the decisive battle her planners had always promised was coming. She had survived 2 years of Pacific War combat. She was destroyed by a submarine she never saw, on the first major offensive sortie following her last repair period, in under 2 hours. The Mark 14 torpedo that Kostler fired had its own history worth noting briefly. Through 1942 and much of 1943, the Mark 14 had been the source of enormous frustration among American submarine commanders. It ran too deep, passing beneath its targets. Its contact exploder failed to detonate on direct hits. Its magnetic exploder detonated prematurely or not at all. These were not minor malfunctions. They were design defects that had allowed Japanese warships to survive attacks that should have killed them. and that had contributed to the deaths of American submariners, who pressed attacks under fire only to find their weapons didn't work. The correction of both defects, the depth-keeping mechanism and the Mark VI contact exploder, had been achieved through a combination of formal investigation, field testing conducted by frustrated submarine commanders, who essentially proved the defects by testing them under combat conditions, and engineering corrections that took until late 1943 to fully implement. By June 1944, the corrected Mark XIV was, finally, the weapon it had always been supposed to be. Koestler's 3 hits on the Shokaku were among the most consequential demonstrations of that corrected weapon's capabilities in the entire Pacific War. After the attack, the Kavala was subjected to a counterattack by Shokaku's escorting destroyers, at least 2 of which conducted sustained depth charge attacks for several hours, keeping Kavala at depth and limiting her ability to track the remaining Japanese units. Koestler's war diary records the attacks as vigorous, but notes that none produced damage sufficient to threaten the boat's operational integrity. By the time Kavala was able to return to periscope depth and transmit her contact report, the Shokaku was already gone, and the Taiho's explosion was approximately 3 hours in the past. The 2 fleet carriers that Ozawa had most needed for Eigo's success, his flagship and the battle-hardened veteran of Japan's entire carrier war, were both at the bottom of the Philippine Sea before the afternoon's first wave of the Turkey Shoot had even been counted. I want to note something here about the submarine campaign's contribution to the Philippine Sea battle that the naval aviation history tends to absorb too quickly. The conventional telling of the battle emphasizes the Turkey Shoot, the radar intercepts, the Hellcats, the Marianas Turkey Shoot, as the battle's defining action. And in terms of aircraft destroyed, it was. But in terms of Japanese command capacity degraded, the submarine attacks on June 19th were arguably more consequential than the air battles. The Taiho's sinking removed Ozawa's fleet communications for critical hours during the battle. The Shokaku's sinking removed 1,263 men, including the entirety of the 601st Naval Air Group's aircrew complement, who were aboard for the operation. Experienced men whose loss compounded the air group attrition from the Turkey Shoot itself. The submarines didn't just sink ships, they decapitated the command architecture and destroyed the trained personnel who might, in theory, have reconstituted the carrier air groups for future operations. To me, the most precise way to measure the Shokaku's loss is not in tonnage or personnel, but in accumulated institutional knowledge. She had been in continuous frontline service since September 1941. Her surviving crew members, the officers, the petty officers, the senior mechanics and damage control specialists who had kept her operational through 2 years of combat, represented a concentration of practical carrier operating experience that no training program could rapidly reproduce. Most of them died with her. The remaining carrier force after June 19th was not just numerically reduced, it was depleted of exactly the kind of experienced senior enlisted and junior officer personnel who carry an institution's practical knowledge from one generation to the next. Japan's carrier navy after the Philippine Sea wasn't just smaller, it was shallower. Chapter 14. The Commanders on Both Sides. What They Knew and When. 23:45 on the 18th of June, 1944. In the intelligence compartment aboard USS Lexington, a typed document sits on a plotting table, the Fleet Intelligence Summary for June 18th, compiled from submarine contact reports, radio direction finding fixes, signals intelligence, and cross-referenced against the Z-Plan translation that American commanders have been studying for weeks. The document places Ozawa's fleet to within approximately 48 kilometers of its actual position. It estimates Japanese aircraft strength at between 380 and 420 carrier-based aircraft, slightly under the actual figure of 430, but close enough to be operationally useful. A handwritten annotation in the margin notes, "Formation consistent with predicted Eigo deployment." At roughly the same hour, aboard a Japanese cruiser functioning as a communications relay for the first mobile fleet, the best available Japanese intelligence summary for the same period places the American fleet approximately 120 kilometers from its actual position, an error large enough to affect the navigation calculations for every aircraft Ozawa is about to launch. 2 documents covering the same geography on the same night, in the same war, One is describing reality. The other is not. The intelligence asymmetry between Spruance's command and Ozawa's on the eve of the battle was not primarily a product of American ingenuity or Japanese failure in any simple sense. It was the product of infrastructure, of 2 years of investment in signals intelligence capability, submarine surveillance networks, and multi-source intelligence fusion that the Americans had been building since before the Pearl Harbor attack, against a Japanese intelligence system that had excellent individual components, but had never been designed to integrate them into a unified, near real-time picture available to fleet commanders. American fleet intelligence in June 1944 drew on 3 simultaneous streams: ultra and magic signals intelligence from broken Japanese diplomatic and naval codes, which provided strategic-level information about Japanese order of battle and intent; radio direction-finding triangulation, which provided tactical position fixes accurate to within roughly 50 kilometers; and submarine contact reports, which provided the most current and tactically precise information about Japanese fleet movements. These 3 streams were integrated at Pearl Harbor, processed into summary assessments, and distributed to fleet commanders within 2 to 6 hours of collection. Spruance received a composite picture. Ozawa received fragments. The specific failure of Ozawa's intelligence picture on June 18th and 19th traces most directly to the land-based air situation, which was the intelligence gap with the most immediate operational consequences. Kakuta's refusal, or inability, to accurately report the destruction of his airfields meant that Ozawa was planning operations on the basis of a land-based air supplement that was approximately 1/5 of what he believed it to be. He anticipated roughly 100 land-based aircraft available for AGO coordination. He had approximately 20. The shuttle bombing plan that was the architectural center of his operational concept, the plan that gave his carrier aircraft their range advantage and their second strike capability, required functional diversion bases that didn't exist in the form he believed they did. Every navigational calculation his pilots were given for the Guam diversion was based on the assumption of a functional receiving airfield. The actual Orode field on Guam, when the 4th wave surviving aircraft tried to land there, was under American attack, short of fuel, and unable to service more than a handful of aircraft even under ideal conditions. Spruance's intelligence advantage expressed itself most clearly in his pre-battle positioning decision. Specifically, the placement of the battleship and cruiser screen to the west of the carrier force, where it would serve as the outer anti-aircraft layer for any incoming attack, and the positioning of the carriers themselves to give the combat air patrol maximum room for their intercept vectors. These dispositions were not obvious or automatic. They required a commander who understood, in advance, the approximate bearing and range from which the attack would come, information that Spruance's intelligence picture provided, and that the Z-plan's documented attack geometry reinforced. The fighter direction officers aboard the carriers knew, when the first radar contact appeared at 957 on the morning of June 19th, approximately which bearing it would be coming from, approximately how many aircraft to expect, and approximately how much time they had to organize the intercept. That foreknowledge, translated into pre-positioned aircraft at the right altitudes on the right bearings, was worth more than any number of additional aircraft. There's a specific moment in the intelligence narrative that I find particularly revealing about the nature of the asymmetry. And it's not a dramatic intelligence success, but a quiet illustration of how each side was processing information differently. Shortly before midnight on June 18th, Nimitz forwarded Spruance a radio intercept. A Japanese vessel had broken radio silence, and direction finding had placed the transmission approximately 355 miles west-southwest of Task Force 58. This was, in fact, Ozawa's fleet. But Mitcher and Burke, discussing the intercept, noted that Japanese operational doctrine sometimes involved sending a single vessel off to break radio silence as a deliberate deception, a way of placing false position information in the hands of an enemy who might be listening. They were uncertain whether the intercept was genuine or a plant. They discussed it. They debated it. They eventually concluded the position was likely accurate. The fact that this discussion happened, that American commanders were systematically applying skepticism to their own intelligence and asking whether it might be manipulated, reflects an institutional culture of intelligence evaluation that the Japanese command system did not practice with comparable discipline. Japan's post-battle reliance on overcounted pilot reports as the basis for planning was the mirror image of the same problem. Information flowing upward through the hierarchy was assumed to be accurate rather than critically evaluated. Ozawa's communications blackout after the Taiho's sinking introduced a command vacuum at the worst possible moment. For several hours on the afternoon of June 19th, hours during which the fourth wave was being destroyed over Guam, during which surviving aircraft from the first three waves were attempting to find their carriers or divert to islands, during which Ozawa had no reliable picture of what had happened. The commander of the first mobile fleet was aboard a cruiser without his codebooks, without his communications staff, and without his battle logs. His second-in-command aboard Zuikaku was operating without clear authority. The surviving ships of the van force, under Vice Admiral Kurita, were receiving no fleet-level guidance. The command structure that AGO required to function, centralized direction of multiple tactical units simultaneously, with the commander having a current picture of the overall situation, had ceased to exist at the moment when it was most needed. American Task Force 58, by contrast, maintained complete command continuity throughout the battle, with Mitcher on Lexington and Spruance on Indianapolis, in constant communication, and with a current intelligence picture available to both throughout the engagement. What I find most striking when I lay the two intelligence pictures side by side, Spruance's pre-battle summary against Ozawa's, is not the individual gaps in the Japanese picture, but the cumulative effect of those gaps on decision-making confidence. Spruance had enough information to make decisions he could reasonably defend. He knew the Japanese were coming. He knew approximately from which direction. He knew approximately how many aircraft to expect. He knew the structure of the plan they were executing. His decisions, stay east, protect the transports, wait for the attack, followed logically from his information. Ozawa had enough information to know he had to attack, but not enough to know whether his attack was viable or what he was actually attacking. His decisions, execute the plan, trust the pilot reports, plan a second day of operations, followed logically from his information too. The difference is that Spruance's information was approximately accurate, and Ozawa's was systematically wrong. When both commanders were acting rationally on the basis of what they knew, one of them was acting rationally in contact with reality, and the other was not. That gap, more than any asymmetry in hardware or pilot quality, is what made the battle's outcome so one-sided. Chapter 15. The Aftermath. What both navies knew the morning after. 0900 hours, the 21st of June, 1944. At a combined fleet communications relay facility in the Western Pacific, a document is being transmitted to Naval Headquarters at Kure. It is the preliminary accounting of what the first mobile fleet still has available for operations. The number of carrier aircraft listed as operationally serviceable across the entire mobile fleet, all 9 carriers, all air groups, everything that hadn't been shot down or ditched or destroyed in the previous 48 hours, is 35. The document is accurate. Someone at the receiving end has circled the number and written beside it in pencil, "This cannot be right." It was right. Japan had entered the Battle of the Philippine Sea with 430 carrier aircraft. It was ending the battle with 35. The carrier air arm that had been a decade in the building was functionally gone, not in a series of gradual losses, but in a single day over the Philippine Sea. The penciled note beside the number 35, the reluctance of someone at a receiving terminal to accept what the document was plainly saying, is, to me, the most human moment in the entire archive. The American accounting on the morning of June 21st was conducted with the kind of administrative efficiency that comes from a command structure that is still fully functional. Task Force 58's after-action summary recorded 109 Americans dead, 29 aircraft lost in air-to-air combat, 80 aircraft lost in the June 20th evening strike return, 1 battleship, USS South Dakota, moderately damaged by a bomb hit that had killed or wounded more than 50 men, but left the ship in action throughout the engagement. 3 carriers with superficial damage from near misses. Against these figures, 3 Japanese carriers sunk, 2 oilers sunk, approximately 600 Japanese aircraft destroyed across both days of fighting, Approximately 2,987 Japanese dead. The senior American staff officer, who noted the results, described the outcome, in restrained professional language, as a satisfactory outcome given mission priorities. This was not understatement as a rhetorical device. It was the literal assessment of a command that had accomplished its primary mission, the protection of the Saipan landing force, and its secondary mission, the destruction of Japanese carrier air power, and was already focused on what came next. Ozawa reached Okinawa with the surviving elements of the first mobile fleet on the 22nd of June. His formal after-action report, submitted to the combined fleet, attributed the outcome primarily to the unanticipated destruction of land-based air support, the force multiplier that was supposed to have supplemented his carriers, and had instead been a phantom throughout the engagement. He recommended that the tactical concept of land-based air supplementation be abandoned in future planning, and that any future decisive battle attempt be structured around carrier aviation alone, without the assumption of land-based coordination. This was a sound operational conclusion from the battle's evidence. It was also, by June 1944, an operationally meaningless one. Japan no longer had a carrier air arm that could fight a battle, with or without land-based supplementation. The recommendation that the next decisive battle be structured differently was a recommendation for a battle Japan could no longer fight. The post-battle blame assignment within the Japanese naval hierarchy followed a predictable institutional pattern that the post-war interrogation record documents fairly clearly. Investigation focused on three areas: the failure of land-based air coordination, Kakuta's command; the unanticipated effectiveness of American radar and fighter direction, described in Japanese post-battle analysis as a technological surprise; and the submarine threat, which had been assessed as manageable at the planning stage. There was no formal investigation of the training quality shortfall, the most fundamental and most predetermined cause of the defeat. The official post-war Japanese naval history, the Senshi Sosho, compiled by the Japan Defense Agency between 1966 and 1980, attributes the defeat primarily to land-based air failure and American technological superiority. The training crisis, the petroleum logistics crisis, the Z-plan intelligence penetration, these appear in the Senshi Sosho, but are not positioned as primary causes. The institutional reluctance to accept that the fundamental failure was in human quality, rather than in circumstance or enemy technology, survived the battle and shaped the post-war historical narrative. The kamikaze seed deserves explicit treatment here, because the trajectory from the Philippine Sea to the first kamikaze units is shorter and more direct than the popular history usually acknowledges. In the combined fleet's internal discussions following June 19th, the concept of special attack aircraft, planes loaded with explosives and flown by their pilots deliberately into enemy ships, began to surface as a solution to a problem that the battle had made impossible to ignore. The problem was that conventional attack with replacement pilots of 150 to 200 hours training produced, as June 19th had demonstrated conclusively, essentially no results against a properly defended American fleet. The mathematics were clear. Conventionally trained replacement pilots couldn't hit maneuvering warships reliably enough to justify the consumption of aircraft and men. The kamikaze concept addressed this problem by changing the question. If the pilot doesn't need to pull out of his attack run, if he only needs to reach the target and hold course for the last few seconds, then the specific flying skills that the training pipeline couldn't produce in sufficient time became less relevant. 150 hours of flight training was inadequate to execute a conventional attack. It might be adequate to execute a one-way attack on a large, stationary target. The concept was formally authorized by Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi in October 1944. The deliberate self-sacrifice of pilot Sakio Komatsu, who on June 19th had dove his aircraft into an albacore torpedo to deflect it from the Taiho, was cited in some of the combined fleet discussion documents as a model. The trajectory from that torpedo deflection to the formalized kamikaze program is 4 months long. No Japanese admiral was formally court-martialed or disciplined for the Philippine Sea defeat. Ozawa offered his resignation. It was refused. He was retained in command, and 4 months later, he was given command of the decoy carrier force for the Battle of Leyte Gulf, a mission in which his carriers, carrying no aircraft, were used to draw Halsey's fleet north, while a separate Japanese surface force attempted to attack the Leyte landing area. He performed this role with tactical skill, drawing Halsey away from his assigned position. He was more useful to Japan as a competent commander with empty carriers than most Japanese admirals would have been with full ones. The institutional culture that had produced the defeat, the suppression of unfavorable analysis, the overcounting of battle results, the refusal to formally acknowledge training deficiencies, survived the battle intact. It would remain intact until there was nothing left for it to manage. Chapter 16. The Production War. Why America could afford this battle and Japan could not. A factory floor in Bethpage, Long Island, 1944. The building is 120 meters long, and the ceiling is high enough that the upper sections of it catch a different quality of light than the floor. Along its length, in a line that extends from one end to the other, Grumman F-6F Hellcats are being assembled in various stages of completion, some with their wings folded, some with engines installed, some being walked toward the paint bay, some already finished and waiting for delivery to the naval air stations. The assembly rate, according to the War Production Board's quarterly statistical report for the second quarter of 1944, is one completed aircraft approximately every 18 minutes of a continuous production shift. One Hellcat every 18 minutes. At the Mitsubishi assembly facility producing the A6M0 Sen during the same period, the production cycle for a completed aircraft runs approximately 12 hours per airframe. These numbers don't tell you everything about the Pacific Air War. They tell you the part that the rest of this series has been building toward, the part that made everything else inevitable. The Essex-class fleet carrier production program is the structural fact that underlies every other fact in this series. Between December 1942 and June 1944, a period of 18 months, the United States commissioned 7 Essex-class fleet carriers, in addition to 8 Independence-class light carriers. Each Essex-class ship displaced approximately 27,100 tons standard, and could operate more than 90 aircraft. Each Independence class displaced approximately 11,000 tons and could operate approximately 33 aircraft. The combined aviation capacity added to the United States Navy in those 18 months, the decks, the aviation fuel systems, the arresting gear, the hangar spaces, the magazines, exceeded the total aviation capacity of the entire Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force, as it had existed at the beginning of the Pacific War. Japan had spent a decade building its carrier force. America had replaced it and then surpassed it in a year and a half. The production comparison isn't a context for the Battle of the Philippine Sea. It is the explanation for why the battle ended the way it did. The American pilot training pipeline in 1944 produced approximately 1,000 combat-ready carrier-qualified pilots per month from its facilities at Pensacola, Corpus Christi, and the satellite training bases that had been constructed across the southeastern United States. Each of these pilots averaged approximately 360 flight hours before carrier qualification, significantly above the wartime minimum, and more than double the average hours of the replacement pilots flying for Ozawa's air groups on June 19th. After the battle, the American carriers that had lost aircraft in the engagement, 29 in air-to-air combat, 80 in the June 20th strike return, were receiving replacement aircraft and replacement pilots within approximately 2 weeks. The men who flew the Turkey Shoot could be replaced, qualitatively and quantitatively, within a fortnight. Japan's losses in the same battle required years to replace at anything approaching the original standard. The asymmetry in replacement time is itself the strategic answer to the question of why America could afford the Philippine Sea and Japan could not. Japanese aircraft production figures for the second quarter of 1944 present their own specific kind of argument. Total Japanese aircraft production, all types, for the quarter was approximately 2,800 aircraft. Of these, roughly 800 were carrier-capable types, Zeros, Judys, Kates, and the Nakajima B-6N Tenzan torpedo bombers that were entering service as Kate replacements. 800 aircraft in 3 months, against the more than 3,000 naval combat aircraft produced by American factories in the same period. The production gap was large. More important than the raw gap, however, was the quality distribution within Japanese production. The Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, Japan's best fighter design of 1944, potentially competitive with the Hellcat, took approximately 2.5 times as long per airframe to manufacture as the F-6 F-3, because its design pushed the boundaries of what Japan's precision machining industry could consistently produce. Quality control problems with engine and airframe components were documented throughout the Hayate's production run. Japan's best aircraft were difficult to build well. America's best aircraft were being built at one every 18 minutes. The logistics comparison deserves a specific technical note that the popular histories typically compress too quickly. The Essex-class carriers' fire suppression systems, carbon dioxide flooding for hangar bays, halon-equivalent suppression systems at fuel distribution points, hangar deck access controls that could seal individual hangar compartments during a fire, had been specifically designed in the aftermath of the Lexington's loss at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, where accumulated aviation fuel vapors had caused the same category of cascading internal explosion that would later destroy the Taiho. American carrier designers had encountered the same engineering problem in 1942 and had spent 2 years designing a systemic solution to it. The carriers of Task Force 58 on June 19th were carrying fire suppression infrastructure that the Taiho, designed in 1939 and commissioned in March 1944, did not have. The design gap wasn't about the Americans being smarter. It was about the Americans having encountered the problem earlier, in a context where they could learn from it, in an industrial system that could implement the correction at scale. When I look at the War Production Board reports alongside the naval construction schedules, what strikes me most is not the scale of the production advantage, but its steadiness. American naval production in 1944 wasn't a surge or an emergency maximum effort. It was a sustained, planned, managed output that had been building since before Pearl Harbor, and that was still accelerating in June 1944. 3 additional Essex-class carriers, Franklin, Shangri-La, and Ticonderoga, were fitting out or in sea trials in June of that year, approaching operational readiness before the year's end. Japan, on the same date, had no comparable program, no equivalent industrial base, and no equivalent petroleum supply to train the air groups that would have flown from the carriers, even if they had been built. The production comparison isn't an American triumph story. It's the structural description of a war that had been decided in factories long before it was decided at sea. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was where the factory output in the carrier deck met the Japanese fleet. The result was determined before the aircraft launched. To me, the detail that makes the production comparison humanly real, rather than just arithmetically real, is a single figure from a Grumman production report. The company delivered to the United States Navy, in the second quarter of 1944 alone, 2,041 F-6 F-3 Hellcats. Japan lost approximately 315 carrier aircraft on June 19th. America could replace June 19th in approximately 3 weeks of normal production. Japan could not replace June 19th in the remaining duration of the war. That single figure, 2,041 aircraft in 1 quarter from one manufacturer, is the weight behind everything else in this series. Chapter 17, The Long Reckoning. Why June 19th, 1944 still matters. The 21st of June, 1944, dawn. In the Philippine Sea, roughly 400 kilometers northwest of Saipan, the water is flat in the early morning light. Beneath it, at depths that vary from a few hundred meters to several thousand, the Taiho rests, the Shokaku rests, the Hio rests, 2 oilers rest, the wreckage of perhaps 300 aircraft, Zeros, Judys, Kates, Vals, Tenzan torpedo bombers, machines that had represented the most technically advanced maritime strike force Japan had assembled since Pearl Harbor, rests. In the water around them, already recovered or still being searched for, are the men who flew those aircraft. Task Force 58 is steaming east, toward Saipan, toward the supply ships that will replenish it, toward the next operation. Ozawa's surviving fleet is steaming north. The space between them, the water that was the Philippine Sea battlefield, has gone quiet in the way that sea battlefields go quiet, not peacefully, but completely. 2 days' worth of history, compressed into 112 kilometers of open ocean, settling into the archive. The 6 structural causes of Japan's defeat at the Battle of the Philippine Sea can be stated simply enough. The Kantai Kessen Doctrine that required conditions which no longer existed, The Solomons campaign that consumed the pilot core that Doctrine depended upon. The Z-plan capture that told America exactly what was coming. The Taiho's design and fuel compromise that removed the fleet's flagship and communications at a critical hour. The radar fighter direction system that killed Japanese aircraft before they could attack. And the industrial asymmetry that made American losses recoverable and Japanese losses permanent. Each of these causes was individually insufficient to produce a defeat of the Turkey Shoot's magnitude. Together, converging on a single two-day engagement, they produced a result so one-sided that even Japanese commanders were slow to believe the numbers. What made each individual failure worse was the institutional failure that connected them. The suppression of unfavorable analysis, the inability to tell the truth upward through a hierarchy that penalized bearers of difficult news. The systematic overcounting of results that kept Japanese planning anchored to a version of the war that existed only on paper. The Kantai-Kessen Doctrine's failure wasn't a failure of intelligence or courage. It was a failure of adaptability, the specific kind of institutional rigidity that develops when a theory is so deeply embedded in an organization's culture, career structures, and self-image that challenging it is professionally dangerous regardless of the evidence. Every officer in the Japanese Naval General Staff who expressed doubt about the decisive battle concept before June 1944 was taking a career risk. The institutional pressure toward optimism, toward the operational plan that could be sold internally, toward the assessment that endorsed the course of action already committed to, these are not uniquely Japanese problems. They are problems that appear in every bureaucracy under sufficient pressure. What made them fatal in this case was the specific combination of circumstances, a doctrine that required the enemy to behave predictably, an enemy that had stopped behaving predictably 2 years earlier, and a hierarchy that had not created a mechanism for formally acknowledging the gap between the two. The training collapse between 1942 and 1944 is the cause that most directly produced the Turkey Shoot's specific character. The asymmetry between the Hellcat's execution and the Japanese formation's dissolution. A Japanese carrier air arm flying at the 600-hour pre-war standard would still have lost the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The radar system, the proximity fuses, the Hellcat's performance advantages, and Spruance's intelligence picture would have produced an American victory regardless, but it would have been a different battle, more contested, more expensive for both sides, with a different ratio of Japanese to American losses. The Turkey Shoot's specific quality, the sense of mechanical efficiency, of a defense operating exactly as designed against an attack that couldn't adapt, was the product of the training gap. The 600 hours that Japan had declared non-negotiable in 1934, and had then negotiated away year by year until the standard was less than a third of itself, was the specific quantity whose absence produced the specific result of June 19th. The Z-plan's contribution to the battle is the cause most subject to historical revision, because it depends on the quality of Spruance's prior knowledge and the degree to which that knowledge shaped his decisions differently than pure tactical instinct would have. What the available evidence establishes, Bradshaw's archival reconstruction, Spruance's own post-war account, the Z-plan's documented arrival at fleet command level, is that Spruance knew the structure of Japan's intended operation with a specificity that was unusual in Pacific War fleet engagements, and that this knowledge informed at least his positioning decision regarding the transports. Whether that decision was decisive in itself is debatable. What isn't debatable is that it reflects the intelligence asymmetry that ran throughout the engagement, the gap between a command that knew what was coming and a command that was operating on false or incomplete information. The kamikaze program that grew from the Philippine Sea's ruins is, in retrospect, the most direct and devastating legacy of the battle's lessons, and the least satisfying, because it represents an institutional response that addressed the symptom of the training crisis rather than its cause. If conventionally trained replacement pilots can't hit targets reliably enough to justify their consumption, make the aircraft itself the weapon. The logic was internally consistent. The program killed more American sailors per sortie than conventional Japanese air attack ever had in the battle's final phases. It was also, strategically, a closed loop. The kamikaze traded pilots, men who could, in theory, have survived to fly again, for single engagements whose results were inherently non-repeatable. It was a weapons system that consumed itself, and the institution that produced it simultaneously. The trajectory from the pilot Sakio Komatsu diving into a torpedo on June 19, 1944, to the formalized kamikaze units of October 1944, to the massed attacks at Okinawa in the spring of 1945, is a single, continuous line. The battle that destroyed Japan's carrier air arm also established the template for what replaced it. What the Battle of the Philippine Sea decided, beyond the immediate tactical result, is a question that takes the full length of the war to answer. Saipan fell on the 9th of July. Tinian fell on the 1st of August. Guam fell on the 10th of August. B-29s began flying from the Marianas bases in November 1944. The March 1945 fire raids on Tokyo killed approximately 80,000 people in a single night and destroyed roughly 40 square kilometers of the city. The atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Every one of those events is causally downstream of the 2 days in June 1944, when 35 aircraft came home from a fleet that had launched 430. The trail from June 19th to the war's end runs through those B-29 bases, through those fire raids, through the political collapse of Tojo's government, and the inability of any succeeding Japanese government to negotiate a peace on terms that its military would accept. The Battle of the Philippine Sea didn't end the war. It ended Japan's ability to prevent the war from ending on American terms. I want to be honest about something in this final chapter, that the narrative shape of a documentary series can obscure if you're not careful. The way I've told this story, the structural failures, the institutional rigidities, the training hours, and the petroleum ledgers and the intelligence asymmetries can make it sound as though the defeat was entirely mechanical, as though the outcome was simply the logical result of forces that had been set in motion years before June 19th, and that no individual action could have altered. That reading is partly correct and partly misleading. The structural causes were real. The defeat was overdetermined in the sense that multiple simultaneous failures converged on it. But inside those structural forces were specific human decisions. Kakuta's choice not to report the true state of his airfields, the unnamed damage control officer who opened the Taiho's ventilation fans, the Grumman engineers who kept the armored seat back in the Hellcat's design. Mitcher saying, "Turn on the lights," in 4 words with no explanation. These decisions mattered. They mattered at the margins, which is where history often actually happens, in the gap between what the structural forces determined and what the specific human choices produced. Admiral Ozawa survived the war. He was not charged with war crimes, was not formally disciplined for the Philippine Sea defeat, and in the years following the war's end, he became, in a quiet and historically almost invisible way, part of the institutional foundation of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force that was built in the post-occupation period. The man who led the mobile fleet into the Turkey Shoot helped train the officers who built the maritime security relationship with the United States Navy that has shaped the Pacific's post-war stability. This is not irony in any comfortable sense. It is the specific kind of historical continuity that wars produce when they end, the working out of defeat into something that, over decades, becomes a different kind of order. The Philippine Sea was not the last battle of a lost cause. It was the penultimate chapter in a war that ended, a year and 2 months later, with Japan intact enough to become what it subsequently became. The number that closes this series is the one that opened Chapter 8, 35. 35 carrier aircraft operationally serviceable on the morning of June 21, 1944, across the entire Japanese First Mobile Fleet. The force had launched 430 the previous morning. The margin between 430 and 35, 395 aircraft, 315 of them lost on June 19th alone, is the precise measure of what the battle decided. It decided it not because American pilots were better marksmen or American admirals were bolder planners, though both things contain truth. It decided it because an institution that could not tell itself the truth about its pilots, its fuel, its training, its intelligence picture, and its strategic position had met, at a specific point in the Philippine Sea, on a specific morning in June, an institution that could. In war, the second quality, the ability to know what is actually happening and act on it, turns out to matter more than almost anything else. Japan discovered this on June 19, 1944. The archive has been saying so ever since.